Chapter 13 of the Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. On English Novelists of the Present Day. In this chapter I will venture to name a few successful novelists of my own time, with whose works I am acquainted, and will endeavour to point whence their success has come, and why they have failed when there has been failure. I do not hesitate to name Thackeray the first. His knowledge of human nature was supreme, and his characters stand out as human beings, with a force and a truth which has not, I think, been within the reach of any other English novelist in any period. I know no character in fiction, unless it be Don Quixote, with whom the reader becomes so intimately acquainted as with Colonel Newcome. How great a thing it is to be a gentleman at all parts! How we admire the man of whom so much may be said with truth! Is there any one of whom we feel more sure in this respect than of Colonel Newcome? It is not because Colonel Newcome is a perfect gentleman that we think Thackeray's work to have been so excellent, but because he has had the power to describe him as such, and to force us to love him, a weak and silly old man, on account of this grace of character. It is evident from all Thackeray's best work that he lived with the characters he was creating. He had always a story to tell until quite late in life, and he shows us that this was so, not by the interest which he had in his own plots, for I doubt whether his plots did occupy much of his mind, but by convincing us that his characters were alive to himself. With Becky Sharp, with Lady Castlewood and her daughter, and with Esmond, with Warrington, Pendennis, and the Major, with Colonel Newcome, and with Barry Lyndon, he must have lived in perpetual intercourse. Therefore he has made these personages real to us. Among all our novelists his style is the purest, as to my ear it is also the most harmonious. Sometimes it is disfigured by a slight touch of affectation, by little conceits which smell of the oil, but the language is always lucid. The reader, without labour, knows what he means, and knows all that he means. As well as I can remember, he deals with no episodes. I think that any critic, examining his work minutely, would find that every scene, and every part of every scene, adds something to the clearness with which the story is told. Among all his stories there is not one which does not leave on the mind a feeling of distress that women should ever be immodest, or men dishonest, and of joy that women should be so devoted and men so honest. How we hate the idle selfishness of Pendennis, the worldliness of Beatrix, the craft of Becky Sharp! How we love the honesty of Colonel Newcome, the nobility of Esmond, and the devoted affection of Mrs. Pendennis! The hatred of evil and love of good can hardly have come upon so many readers without doing much good. Late in Thackeray's life, he never was an old man, but towards the end of his career, he failed in his power of charming, because he allowed his mind to become idle. In the plots which he conceived, and in the language which he used, I do not know that there is any perceptible change. But in the Virginians and in Philip the reader is introduced to no character with which he makes a close and undying acquaintance. And this, I have no doubt, is so because Thackeray himself had no such intimacy. His mind had come to be weary of that fictitious life which is always demanding the labour of new creation, and he troubled himself with his two Virginians and his Philip only when he was seated at his desk. At the present moment George Eliot is the first of English novelists, and I am disposed to place her second of those of my time. She is best known to the literary world as a writer of prose fiction, and not improbably whatever of permanent fame she may acquire will come from her novels. But the nature of her intellect is very far removed indeed from that which is common to the tellers of stories. Her imagination is no doubt strong, but it acts in analysing rather than in creating. Everything that comes before her is pulled to pieces so that the inside of it shall be seen, and be seen if possible by her readers as clearly as by herself. This searching analysis is carried so far that in studying her latter writings one feels oneself to be in company with some philosopher rather than with a novelist. I doubt whether any young person can read with pleasure either Felix Holt, Middlemarch, or Daniel Deronda. I know that they are very difficult to many that are not young. Her personifications of character have been singularly terse and graphic, and from them has come her great hold on the public, though by no means the greatest effect which she has produced. The lessons which she teaches remain, though it is not for the sake of the lessons that her pages are read. Seth Bede, Adam Bede, Maggie and Tom Tulliver, old Silas Marner, and, much above all, Tito and Romola, are characters which, when once known, can never be forgotten. I cannot say quite so much for any of those in her later works, because in them the philosopher so greatly overtops the portrait painter, that in the dissection of the mind the outward sign seems to have been forgotten. In her as yet there is no symptom whatever of that weariness of mind, which, when felt by the reader, induces him to declare that the author has written himself out. It is not from decadence that we do not have another Mrs. Poyser, but because the author soars to things which seem to her to be higher than Mrs. Poyser. It is, I think, the defect of George Eliot that she struggles too hard to do work that shall be excellent. She lacks ease. Latterly the signs of this have been conspicuous in her style, which has always been and is singularly correct, but which has become occasionally obscure from her too great desire to be pungent. It is impossible not to feel the struggle, and that feeling begets a flavour of affectation. In Daniel Deronda, of which at this moment only a portion has been published, there are sentences which I have found myself compelled to read 3 times before I have been able to take home to myself all that the writer has intended. Perhaps I may be permitted here to say that this gifted woman was among my dearest and most intimate friends. As I am speaking here of novelists, I will not attempt to speak of George Eliot's merit as a poet. There can be no doubt that the most popular novelist of my time, probably the most popular English novelist of any time, has been Charles Dickens. He has now been dead nearly 6 years, and the sale of his books goes on as it did during his life. The certainty with which his novels are found in every house, the familiarity of his name in all English-speaking countries, the popularity of such characters as Mrs. Gamp, Micawber, and Pecksniff, and many others whose names have entered into the English language and become well-known words, the grief of the country at his death, and the honours paid to him at his funeral, all testify to his popularity. Since the last book he wrote himself, I doubt whether any book has been so popular as his biography by John Forster. There is no withstanding such testimony as this. Such evidence of popular appreciation should go for very much, almost for everything, in criticism on the work of a novelist. The primary object of a novelist is to please, and this man's novels have been found more pleasant than those of any other writer. It might, of course, be objected to this, that though the books have pleased they have been injurious, that their tendency has been immoral and their teaching vicious, but it is almost needless to say that no such charge has ever been made against Dickens. His teaching has ever been good. From all which there arises to the critic a question, whether, with such evidence against him as to the excellence of this writer, he should not subordinate his own opinion to the collected opinion of the world of readers. To me it almost seems that I must be wrong to place Dickens after Thackeray and George Eliot, knowing as I do that so great a majority put him above those authors. My own peculiar idiosyncrasy in the matter forbids me to do so. I do acknowledge that Mrs. Gamp, Micawber, Pecksniff, and others have become household words in every house, as though they were human beings. But to my judgment they are not human beings, nor are any of the characters human which Dickens has portrayed. It has been the peculiarity and the marvel of this man's power, that he has invested his puppets with a charm that has enabled him to dispense with human nature. There is a drollery about them, in my estimation, very much below the humour of Thackeray, but which has reached the intellect of all, while Thackeray's humour has escaped the intellect of many. Nor is the pathos of Dickens human. It is stagey and melodramatic, but it is so expressed that it touches every heart a little. There is no real life in Smike. His misery, his idiocy, his devotion for Nicholas, his love for Kate, are all overdone and incompatible with each other. But still the reader sheds a tear. Every reader can find a tear for Smike. Dickens's novels are like Boucicault's plays. He has known how to draw his lines broadly, so that all should see the colour. He too in his best days always lived with his characters, and he too, as he gradually ceased to have the power of doing so, ceased to charm. Though they are not human beings, we all remember Mrs. Gamp and Pickwick. The Boffins and Veneerings do not, I think, dwell in the minds of so many. Of Dickens's style it is impossible to speak in praise. It is jerky, ungrammatical, and created by himself in defiance of rules, almost as completely as that created by Carlyle. To readers who have taught themselves to regard language it must therefore be unpleasant. But the critic is driven to feel the weakness of his criticism when he acknowledges to himself, as he is compelled in all honesty to do, that with the language, such as it is, the writer has satisfied the great mass of the readers of his country. Both these great writers have satisfied the readers of their own pages. But both have done infinite harm by creating a school of imitators. No young novelist should ever dare to imitate the style of Dickens. If such a one wants a model for his language, let him take Thackeray. Bulwer, or Lord Lytton, but I think that he is still better known by his earlier name, was a man of very great parts. Better educated than either of those I have named before him, he was always able to use his erudition, and he thus produced novels from which very much not only may be but must be learned by his readers. He thoroughly understood the political status of his own country, a subject on which I think Dickens was marvellously ignorant, and which Thackeray had never studied. He had read extensively, and was always apt to give his readers the benefit of what he knew. The result has been that very much more than amusement may be obtained from Bulwer's novels. There is also a brightness about them, the result rather of thought than of imagination, of study and of care than of mere intellect, which has made many of them excellent in their way. It is perhaps improper to class all his novels together, as he wrote in varied manners, making in his earlier works, such as Pelham and Ernest Maltravers, pictures of a fictitious life, and afterwards pictures of life as he believed it to be, as in My Novel and The Caxtons. But from all of them there comes the same flavour of an effort to produce effect. The effects are produced, but it would have been better if the flavour had not been there. I cannot say of Bulwer as I have of the other novelists whom I have named, that he lived with his characters. He lived with his work, with the doctrines which at the time he wished to preach, thinking always of the effects which he wished to produce. But I do not think he ever knew his own personages, and therefore neither do we know them. Even Pelham and Eugene Aram are not human beings to us, as are Pickwick and Colonel Newcome and Mrs. Poyser. In his plots Bulwer has generally been simple, facile, and successful. The reader never feels with him, as he does with Wilkie Collins, that it is all plot, or, as with George Eliot, that there is no plot. The story comes naturally, without calling for too much attention, and is thus proof of the completeness of the man's intellect. His language is clear, good, intelligible English, but it is defaced by mannerism. In all that he did, affectation was his fault. How shall I speak of my dear old friend Charles Lever, and his rattling, jolly, joyous, swearing Irishmen? Surely never did a sense of vitality come so constantly from a man's pen, nor from man's voice, as from his. I knew him well for many years, and whether in sickness or in health, I have never come across him without finding him to be running over with wit and fun. Of all the men I have encountered, he was the surest fund of drollery. I have known many witty men, many who could say good things, many who would sometimes be ready to say them when wanted, though they would sometimes fail. But he never failed. Rouse him in the middle of the night, and wit would come from him before he was half awake. And yet he never monopolised the talk, was never a bore. He would take no more than his own share of the words spoken, and would yet seem to brighten all that was said during the night. His earlier novels, the later I have not read, are just like his conversation. The fun never flags, and to me, when I read them, they were never tedious. As to character, he can hardly be said to have produced it. Corney Delaney, the old manservant, may perhaps be named as an exception. Lever's novels will not live long, even if they may be said to be alive now, because it is so. What was his matter of working I do not know, but I should think it must have been very quick, and that he never troubled himself on the subject, except when he was seated with a pen in his hand. Charlotte Brontë was surely a marvellous woman. If it could be right to judge the work of a novelist from one small portion of one novel, and to say of an author that he is to be accounted as strong as he shows himself to be in the strongest morsel of work, I should be inclined to put Miss Brontë very high indeed. I know no interest more thrilling than that which she has been able to throw into the characters of Rochester and the governess, in the second volume of Jane Eyre. She lived with those characters, and felt every fibre of the heart, the longings of the one and the sufferings of the other. And therefore, though the end of the book is weak and the beginning not very good, I venture to predict that Jane Eyre will be read among English novels when many whose names are now better known shall have been forgotten. Jane Eyre and Esmond and Adam Bede will be in the hands of our grandchildren when Pickwick and Pelham and Harry Lorrequer are forgotten. Because the men and women depicted are human in their aspirations, human in their sympathies, and human in their actions. In Villette, too, and in Shirley, there is to be found human life as natural and as real, though in circumstances not so full of interest as those told in Jane Eyre. The character of Paul in the former of the two is a wonderful study. She must herself have been in love with some Paul when she wrote the book, and have been determined to prove to herself that she was capable of loving one whose exterior circumstances were mean, and in every way unprepossessing. There is no writer of the present day who has so much puzzled me by his eccentricities, impracticabilities, and capabilities as Charles Reade. I look upon him as endowed almost with genius, but as one who has not been gifted by nature with ordinary powers of reasoning. He can see what is grandly noble, and admire it with all his heart. He can see, too, what is foully vicious, and hate it with equal ardour. But in the common affairs of life he cannot see what is right or wrong, and as he is altogether unwilling to be guided by the opinion of others, he is constantly making mistakes in his literary career, and subjecting himself to reproach which he hardly deserves. He means to be honest. He means to be especially honest, more honest than other people. He has written a book called The Eighth Commandment on Belief of Honesty in Literary Transactions, a wonderful work, which has, I believe, been read by very few. I never saw a copy except that in my own library, or heard of any one who knew the book. Nevertheless, it is a volume that must have taken very great labour, and have been written, as indeed he declares that it was written, without the hope of pecuniary reward. He makes an appeal to the British Parliament and British people on behalf of literary honesty, declaring that should he fail, "I shall have to go on blushing for the people I was born among." And yet of all the writers of my day he has seemed to me to understand literary honesty the least. On one occasion, as he tells us in the book, he bought for a certain sum from a French author the right of using a plot taken from a play, which he probably might have used without such purpose, and also without infringing any international copyright act. The French author not unnaturally praises him for the transaction, telling him that he is un vrai gentleman. The plot was used by Reade in a novel, and a critic discovering the adaptation made known his discovery to the public. Whereupon the novelist became angry, called his critic a pseudonymuncle, and defended himself by stating the fact of his own purchase. In all this he seems to me to ignore what we all mean when we talk of literary plagiarism and literary honesty. The sin of which the author is accused is not that of taking another man's property, but of passing off as his own creation that which he did not himself create. When an author puts his name to a book he claims to have written all that there is therein, unless he makes direct signification to the contrary. Some years subsequently there arose another similar question, in which Mr. Reade's opinion was declared even more plainly, and certainly very much more publicly. In a tale which he wrote he inserted a dialogue which he took from Swift, and took without any acknowledgment. As might have been expected, one of the critics of the day fell foul of him for this barefaced plagiarism. The author, however, defended himself, with much abuse of the critic, by asserting that whereas Swift had found the jewel, he had supplied the setting; an argument in which there was some little wit, and would have been much excellent truth had he given the words as belonging to Swift and not to himself. The novels of a man possessed of so singular a mind must themselves be very strange, and they are strange. It has generally been his object to write down some abuse with which he has been particularly struck, the harshness, for instance, with which paupers or lunatics are treated, or the wickedness of certain classes, and he always, I think, leaves upon his readers an idea of great earnestness of purpose. But he has always left at the same time on my mind so strong a conviction that he has not really understood his subject, that I have ever found myself taking the part of those whom he has accused. So good a heart and so wrong a head surely no novelist ever before had combined. In story telling he has occasionally been almost great. Among his novels I would especially recommend The Cloister and the Hearth. I do not know that in this work or in any he has left a character that will remain, but he has written some of his scenes so brightly that to read them would always be a pleasure. Of Wilkie Collins it is impossible for a true critic not to speak with admiration, because he has excelled all his contemporaries in a certain most difficult branch of his art. But as it is a branch which I have not myself at all cultivated, it is not unnatural that his work should be very much lost upon me individually. When I sit down to write a novel I do not at all know, and I do not very much care, how it is to end. Wilkie Collins seems so to construct his, that he not only before writing plans everything on, down to the minutest detail, from the beginning to the end, but then plots it all back again to see that there is no piece of necessary dovetailing which does not dovetail with absolute accuracy. The construction is most minute and most wonderful, but I can never lose the taste of the construction. The author seems always to be warning me to remember that something happened at exactly 2:30 on Tuesday morning, or that a woman disappeared from the road just 15 yards beyond the 4th milestone. One is constrained by mysteries and hemmed in by difficulties, knowing, however, that the mysteries will be made clear, and the difficulties overcome at the end of the 3rd volume. Such work gives me no pleasure. I am, however, quite prepared to acknowledge that the want of pleasure comes from fault of my intellect. There are two ladies of whom I would fain say a word, though I feel that I am making my list too long, in order that I may declare how much I have admired their work. They are Annie Thackeray and Rhoda Broughton. I have known them both, and have loved the former almost as though she belonged to me. No two writers were ever more dissimilar, except in this that they are both feminine. Miss Thackeray's characters are sweet, charming, and quite true to human nature. In her writings she is always endeavouring to prove that good produces good and evil evil. There is not a line of which she need be ashamed, not a sentiment of which she should not be proud. But she writes like a lazy writer who dislikes her work, and who allows her own want of energy to show itself in her pages. Miss Broughton, on the other hand, is full of energy, though she too, I think, can become tired over her work. She, however, does take the trouble to make her personages stand upright on the ground. And she has the gift of making them speak as men and women do speak. "You beast!" said Nancy, sitting on the wall, to the man who was to be her husband, thinking that she was speaking to her brother. Now Nancy, whether right or wrong, was just the girl who would, as circumstances then were, have called her brother a beast. There is nothing wooden about any of Miss Broughton's novels, and in these days so many novels are wooden. But they are not sweet-savoured as are those by Miss Thackeray, and are therefore less true to nature. In Miss Broughton's determination not to be mawkish and missish, she has made her ladies do and say things which ladies would not do and say. They throw themselves at men's heads, and when they are not accepted only think how they may throw themselves again. Miss Broughton is still so young that I hope she may live to overcome her fault in this direction. There is one other name without which the list of best-known English novelists of my time would certainly be incomplete, and that is the name of the present Prime Minister of England. Mr. Disraeli has written so many novels, and has been so popular as a novelist, that, whether for good or ill, I feel myself compelled to speak of him. He began his career as an author early in life, publishing Vivian Grey when he was 23 years old. He was very young for such work, though hardly young enough to justify the excuse that he makes in his own preface, that it is a book written by a boy. Dickens was, I think, younger when he wrote his Sketches by Boz, and as young when he was writing the Pickwick Papers. It was hardly longer ago than the other day when Mr. Disraeli brought out Lothair, and between the two there were 8 or 10 others. To me they have all had the same flavour of paint and unreality. In whatever he has written he has affected something which has been intended to strike his readers as uncommon and therefore grand. Because he has been bright, and a man of genius, he has carried his object as regards the young. He has struck them with astonishment, and aroused in their imagination ideas of a world more glorious, more rich, more witty, more enterprising than their own. But the glory has been the glory of pasteboard, and the wealth has been a wealth of tinsel. The wit has been the wit of hairdressers, and the enterprise has been the enterprise of mountebanks. An audacious conjurer has generally been his hero, some youth who by wonderful cleverness can obtain success by every intrigue that comes to his hand. Through it all there is a feeling of stage properties, a smell of hair oil, an aspect of bull, a remembrance of tailors, and that pricking of the conscience which must be the general accompaniment of paste diamonds. I can understand that Mr. Disraeli should by his novels have instigated many a young man and many a young woman on their way in life, but I cannot understand that he should have instigated any one to good. Vivian Grey has had probably as many followers as Jack Sheppard, and has led his followers in the same direction. Lothair, which is as yet Mr. Disraeli's last work, and I think undoubtedly his worst, has been defended on a plea somewhat similar to that by which he has defended Vivian Grey. As that was written when he was too young, so was the other when he was too old for a work of that nature, though not too old to be Prime Minister. If his mind were so occupied with greater things as to allow him to write such a work, yet his judgment should have sufficed to induce him to destroy it when written. Here that flavour of hair oil, that flavour of false jewels, that remembrance of tailors, comes out stronger than in all the others. Lothair is falser even than Vivian Grey, and Lady Corisande and the daughter of the Duchess more inane and unwomanlike than Venetia or Henrietta Temple. It is the very bathos of story-telling. I have often lamented, and have as often excused to myself, that lack of public judgment which enables readers to put up with bad work because it comes from good or from lofty hands. I never felt the feeling so strongly, or was so little able to excuse it, as when a portion of the reading public received Lothair with satisfaction. End of Chapter 13. Recorded with a cold by Jessica Louise, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Chapter 14 of the Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. On Criticism. Literary criticism in the present day has become a profession, but it has ceased to be an art. Its object is no longer that of proving that certain literary work is good, and other literary work is bad, in accordance with rules which the critic is able to define. English criticism at present rarely even pretends to go so far as this. It attempts, in the first place, to tell the public whether a book be or be not worth public attention, and, in the second place, so to describe the purport of the work as to enable those who have not time or inclination for reading it to feel that by a short cut they can become acquainted with its contents. Both these objects, if fairly well carried out, are salutary. Though the critic may not be a profound judge himself, though not unfrequently he be a young man making his first literary attempts, with tastes and judgment still unfixed, yet he probably has a conscience in the matter, and would not have been selected for that work had he not shown some aptitude for it. Though he may not be the best possible guide to the undiscerning, he will be better than no guide at all. Real substantial criticism must, from its nature, be costly, and that which the public wants should at any rate be cheap. Advice is given to many thousands, which, though it may not be the best advice possible, is better than no advice at all. Then that description of the work criticised, that compressing of the much into very little, which is the work of many modern critics or reviewers, does enable many to know something of what is being said, who without it would know nothing. I do not think it is incumbent on me at present to name periodicals in which this work is well done, and to make complaints of others by which it is scamped. I should give offence, and might probably be unjust. But I think I may certainly say that as some of these periodicals are certainly entitled to great praise for the manner in which the work is done generally, so are others open to very severe censure, and that the praise and that the censure are chiefly due on behalf of one virtue and its opposite vice. It is not critical ability that we have a right to demand, or its absence that we are bound to deplore. Critical ability for the price we pay is not attainable. It is a faculty not peculiar to Englishmen, and when displayed is very frequently not appreciated. But that critics should be honest we have a right to demand, and critical dishonesty we are bound to expose. If the writer will tell us what he thinks, though his thoughts be absolutely vague and useless, we can forgive him; but when he tells us what he does not think, actuated either by friendship or by animosity, then there should be no pardon for him. This is the sin in modern English criticism of which there is most reason to complain. It is a lamentable fact that men and women lend themselves to this practice who are neither vindictive nor ordinarily dishonest. It has become the custom of the trade, under the veil of which excuse so many tradesmen justify their malpractices. When a struggling author learns that so much has been done for A by the Barsetshire Gazette, so much for B by the Dillsborough Herald, and again so much for C by that powerful metropolitan organ the Evening Pulpit, and is told also that A and B and C have been favoured through personal interest, he also goes to work among the editors, or the editors' wives, or perhaps, if he cannot reach their wives, with their wives' first or second cousins. When once the feeling has come upon an editor or a critic that he may allow himself to be influenced by other considerations than the duty he owes to the public, all sense of critical or of editorial honesty falls from him at once. Facilis descensus Averni. In a very short time that editorial honesty becomes ridiculous to himself. It is for other purpose that he wields the power. And when he is told what is his duty, and what should be his conduct, the preacher of such doctrine seems to him to be quixotic. "Where have you lived, my friend, for the last 20 years?" he says in spirit, if not in word, "that you come out now with such stuff as old-fashioned as this?" And thus dishonesty begets dishonesty, till dishonesty seems to be beautiful. How nice to be good-natured! How glorious to assist struggling young authors, especially if the young author be also a pretty woman! How gracious to oblige a friend! Then the motive, though still pleasing, departs further from the border of what is good. In what way can the critic better repay the hospitality of his wealthy literary friend than by good-natured criticism, or more certainly ensure for himself a continuation of hospitable favours? Some years since, a critic of the day, a gentleman well known then in literary circles, showed me the manuscript of a book recently published, the work of a popular author. It was handsomely bound, and was a valuable and desirable possession. It had just been given to him by the author as an acknowledgment for a laudatory review in one of the leading journals of the day. As I was expressly asked whether I did not regard such a token as a sign of grace both in the giver and in the receiver, I said that I thought it should neither have been given nor have been taken. My theory was repudiated with scorn, and I was told that I was straight-laced, visionary, and impracticable. In all that, the damage did not lie in the fact of that one present, but in the feeling on the part of the critic that his office was not debased by the acceptance of presents from those whom he criticised. This man was a professional critic, bound by his contract with certain employers to review such books as were sent to him. How could he, when he had received a valuable present for praising one book, censure another by the same author? While I write this, I well know that what I say, if it be ever noticed at all, will be taken as a straining at gnats, as a pretence of honesty, or at any rate as an exaggeration of scruples. I have said the same thing before, and have been ridiculed for saying it. But none the less I am sure that English literature generally is suffering much under this evil. All those who are struggling for success have forced upon them the idea that their strongest efforts should be made in touting for praise. Those who are not familiar with the lives of authors will hardly believe how low will be the forms which their struggles will take, how little presents will be sent to men who write little articles, how much flattery may be expended even on the keeper of a circulating library, with what profuse and distant genuflections approaches are made to the outside railing of the temple which contains within it the great thunderer of some metropolitan periodical publication. The evil here is not only that done to the public when interested counsel is given to them, but extends to the debasement of those who have at any rate considered themselves fit to provide literature for the public. I am satisfied that the remedy for this evil must lie in the conscience and deportment of authors themselves. If once the feeling could be produced that it is disgraceful for an author to ask for praise, and demands for praise are, I think, disgraceful in every walk of life, the practice would gradually fall into the hands only of the lowest, and that which is done only by the lowest soon becomes despicable even to them. The sin, when perpetuated with unflagging labour, brings with it at best very poor reward. That work of running after critics, editors, publishers, the keepers of circulating libraries, and their clerks, is very hard, and must be very disagreeable. He who does it must feel himself to be dishonoured, or she. It may perhaps help to sell an edition, but can never make an author successful. I think it may be laid down as a golden rule in literature that there should be no intercourse at all between an author and his critic. The critic, as critic, should not know his author, nor the author, as author, his critic. As censure should beget no anger, so should praise beget no gratitude. The young author should feel that criticisms fall upon him as dew or hail from heaven, which as coming from heaven man accepts as fate. Praise let the author try to obtain by wholesome effort. Censure let him avoid, if possible, by care and industry. But when they come, let him take them as coming from some source which he cannot influence, and with which he should not meddle. I know no more disagreeable trouble into which an author may plunge himself than of a quarrel with his critics, or any more useless labour than that of answering them. It is wise to presume, at any rate, that the reviewer has simply done his duty, and has spoken of the book according to the dictates of his conscience. Nothing can be gained by combating the reviewer's opinion. If the book which he has disparaged be good, his judgment will be condemned by the praise of others. If bad, his judgment will be confirmed by others. Or if, unfortunately, the criticism of the day be in so evil a condition generally that such ultimate truth cannot be expected, the author may be sure that his efforts made on behalf of his own book will not set matters right. If injustice be done him, let him bear it. To do so is consonant with the dignity of the position which he ought to assume. To shriek and scream and sputter, to threaten actions, and to swear about the town that he has been belied and defamed, and that he has been accused of bad grammar, or a false metaphor, of a dull chapter, or even of a borrowed heroine, will leave on the minds of the public nothing but a sense of irritated impotence. If indeed there should spring from an author's work any assertion by a critic injurious to the author's honour, if the author be accused of falsehood, or of personal motives which are discreditable to him, then indeed he may be bound to answer the charge. It is hoped, however, that he may be able to do so with clean hands, or he will so stir the mud in the pool as to come forth dirtier than he went into it. I have lived much among men by whom the English criticism of the day has been vehemently abused. I have heard it said that to the public it is a false guide, and that to authors it is never a trustworthy mentor. I do not concur in this wholesale censure. There is, of course, criticism and criticism.
There are at this moment one or two periodicals to which both public and authors may safely look for guidance, though there are many others from which no spark of literary advantage may be obtained. But it is well that both public and authors should know what is the advantage which they have a right to expect. There have been critics, and there probably will be again, though the circumstances of English literature do not tend to produce them, with power sufficient to entitle them to speak with authority. These great men have declared, tanquam ex cathedra, that such a book has been so far good and so far bad, or that it has been altogether good or altogether bad, and the world has believed them. When making such assertions, they have given their reasons, explained their causes, and have carried conviction. Very great reputations have been achieved by such critics, but not without infinite study and the labour of many years. Such are not the critics of the day, of whom we are now speaking. In the literary world as it lives at present, some writer is selected for the place of critic to a newspaper, generally some young writer, who for so many shillings a column shall review whatever book is sent to him and express an opinion, reading the book through for the purpose, if the amount of honorarium as measured with the amount of labour will enable him to do so. A labourer must measure his work by his pay, or he cannot live. From criticism such as this must for the most part be, the general reader has no right to expect philosophical analysis or a literary judgment on which confidence may be placed. But he probably may believe that the books praised will be better than the books censured, and that those which are praised by periodicals which never censure are better worth his attention than those which are not noticed. And readers will also find that by devoting an hour or two on Saturday to the criticisms of the week, they will enable themselves to have an opinion about the books of the day. The knowledge so acquired will not be great, nor will that little be lasting, but it adds something to the pleasure of life to be able to talk on subjects of which others are speaking, and the man who has sedulously gone through the literary notices in the Spectator and the Saturday may perhaps be justified in thinking himself as well able to talk about the new book as his friend who has bought that new book on the tapis, and who, not improbably, obtained his information from the same source. As an author, I have paid careful attention to the reviews which have been written on my own work, and I think that now I well know where I may look for a little instruction, where I may expect only greasy adulation, where I shall be cut up into mincemeat for the delight of those who love sharp invective, and where I shall find an equal measure of praise and censure so adjusted, without much judgment, as to exhibit the impartiality of the newspaper and its staff. Among it all there is much chaff, which I have learned how to throw to the winds, with equal disregard whether it praises or blames. But I have also found some corn, on which I have fed and nourished myself, and for which I have been thankful. Chapter 15 of the Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. The Last Chronicle of Barset. Leaving the Post Office. St. Paul's Magazine. I will now go back to the year 1867, in which I was still living at Waltham Cross. I had some time since bought the house there which I had at first hired, and added rooms to it, and made it for our purposes very comfortable. It was, however, a rickety old place, requiring much repair, and occasionally not as weather tight as it should be. We had a domain there sufficient for the cows, and for the making of our butter and hay. For strawberries, asparagus, green peas, out of door peaches, for roses especially, and such everyday luxuries, no place was ever more excellent. It was only 12 miles from London, and admitted therefore of frequent intercourse with the metropolis. It was also near enough to the Ruthin country for hunting purposes. No doubt the Shoreditch station, by which it had to be reached, had its drawbacks. My average distance also to the Essex meets was 20 miles. But the place combined as much or more than I had a right to expect. It was within my own postal district, and had upon the whole been well chosen.
The work that I did during the 12 years that I remained there, from 1859 to 1871, was certainly very great. I feel confident that in amount no other writer contributed so much during that time to English literature. Over and above my novels, I wrote political articles, critical, social, and sporting articles, for periodicals, without number. I did the work of a surveyor of the General Post Office, and so did it as to give the authorities of the department no slightest pretext for fault finding. I hunted always, at least twice a week. I was frequent in the whist room at Garrick. I lived much in society in London, and was made happy by the presence of many friends at Waltham Cross. In addition to this, we always spent 6 weeks at least out of England. Few men, I think, ever lived a fuller life. And I attribute the power of doing this altogether to the virtue of early hours. It was my practice to be at my table every morning at 5:30 A.M., and it was also my practice to allow myself no mercy. An old groom, whose business it was to call me, and to whom I paid £5 a year extra for the duty, allowed himself no mercy. During all those years at Waltham Cross he was never once late with the coffee which it was his duty to bring me. I do not know that I ought not to feel that I owe more to him than to any one else for the success I have had. By beginning at that hour I could complete my literary work before I dressed for breakfast. All those, I think, who have lived as literary men, working daily as literary labourers, will agree with me that 3 hours a day will produce as much as a man ought to write. But then he should so have trained himself that he shall be able to work continuously during those 3 hours, so have tutored his mind that it shall not be necessary for him to sit nibbling his pen and gazing at the wall before him till he shall have found the words with which he wants to express his ideas. It had at this time become my custom, and it still is my custom, though of late I have become a little lenient to myself, to write with my watch before me, and to require from myself 250 words every quarter of an hour. I have found that the 250 words have been forthcoming as regularly as my watch went. But my 3 hours were not devoted entirely to writing. I always began my task by reading the work of the day before, an operation which would take me half an hour, and which consisted chiefly in weighing with my ear the sound of the words and phrases. I would strongly recommend this practice to all tyros in writing. That their work should be read after it has been written is a matter of course. That it should be read twice at least before it goes to the printers I take to be a matter of course. But by reading what he has last written, just before he recommences his task, the writer will catch the tone and spirit of what he is then saying, and will avoid the fault of seeming to be unlike himself. This division of time allowed me to produce over 10 pages of an ordinary novel volume a day, and if kept up through 10 months, would have given as its results 3 novels of 3 volumes each in the year, the precise amount which so greatly acerbated the publisher in Paternoster Row, and which must at any rate be felt to be quite as much as the novel readers of the world can want from the hands of one man. I have never written 3 novels in a year, but by following the plan above described I have written more than as much as 3 volumes. And by adhering to it over a course of years, I have been enabled to have always on hand, for some time back now, 1 or 2 or even 3 unpublished novels in my desk beside me. Were I to die now, there are 3 such besides The Prime Minister, half of which has only yet been issued. One of these has been 6 years finished, and has never seen the light since it was first tied up in the wrapper which now contains it. I look forward with some grim pleasantry to its publication after another period of 6 years, and to the declaration of the critics that it has been the work of a period of life at which the power of writing novels had passed from me. Not improbably, however, these pages may be printed first. In 1866 and 1867 the last Chronicle of Barset was brought out by George Smith in 6d. monthly numbers. I do not know that this mode of publication had been tried before, or that it answered very well on this occasion. Indeed, the shilling magazines had interfered greatly with the success of novels published in numbers without other accompanying matter. The public, finding that so much might be had for a shilling, in which a portion of 1 or more novels was always included, were unwilling to spend their money on the novel alone. Feeling that this certainly had become the case in reference to novels published in shilling numbers, Mr. Smith and I determined to make the experiment with sixpenny parts. As he paid me £3000 for the use of my manuscript, the loss, if any, did not fall upon me. If I remember right, the enterprise was not altogether successful. Taking it as a whole, I regard this as the best novel I have written. I was never quite satisfied with the development of the plot, which consisted in the loss of a cheque, of a charge made against a clergyman for stealing it, and of absolute uncertainty on the part of the clergyman himself as to the manner in which the cheque had found its way into his hands. I cannot quite make myself believe that even such a man as Mr. Crawley could have forgotten how he got it; nor would the generous friend who was anxious to supply his wants have supplied them by tendering the cheque of a third person. Such fault I acknowledge, acknowledging at the same time that I have never been capable of constructing with complete success the intricacies of a plot that required to be unravelled. But while confessing so much, I claim to have portrayed the mind of the unfortunate man with great accuracy and great delicacy. The pride, the humility, the manliness, the weakness, the conscientious rectitude, and bitter prejudices of Mr. Crawley were, I feel, true to nature and well described. The surroundings too are good. Mrs. Proudie at the palace is a real woman, and the poor old dean dying at the deanery is also real. The archdeacon in his victory is very real. There is a true savour of English country life all through the book. It was with many misgivings that I killed my old friend Mrs. Proudie. I could not, I think, have done it but for a resolution taken and declared under circumstances of great momentary pressure. It was thus that it came about. I was sitting one morning at work upon the novel at the end of the long drawing room of the Athenaeum Club, as was then my wont when I had slept the previous night in London. As I was there, two clergymen, each with a magazine in his hand, seated themselves, one on one side of the fire and one on the other, close to me. They soon began to abuse what they were reading, and each was reading some part of some novel of mine. The gravamen of their complaint lay in the fact that I reintroduced the same characters so often. "Here," said one, "is that archdeacon whom we have had in every novel he has ever written." "And here," said the other, "is the old duke whom he has talked about till everybody is tired of him. If I could not invent new characters, I would not write novels at all." Then one of them fell foul of Mrs. Proudie. It was impossible for me not to hear their words, and almost impossible to hear them and be quiet. I got up, standing between them. I acknowledged myself to be the culprit. "As to Mrs. Proudie," I said, "I will go home and kill her before the week is over." And so I did. The two gentlemen were utterly confounded, and one of them begged me to forget his frivolous observations. I have sometimes regretted the deed, so great was my delight in writing about Mrs. Proudie, so thorough was my knowledge of all the shades of her character. It was not only that she was a tyrant, a bully, a would-be priestess, a very vulgar woman, and one who would send headlong to the nethermost pit all who disagreed with her, but that at the same time she was conscientious, by no means a hypocrite, really believing in the brimstone which she threatened, and anxious to save the souls around her from its horrors. And as her tyranny increased, so did the bitterness of the moments of her repentance increase, in that she knew herself to be a tyrant, till that bitterness killed her. Since her time others have grown up, equally dear to me, Lady Glencora and her husband, for instance, but I have never dissevered myself from Mrs. Proudie, and still live much in company with her ghost. I have in a previous chapter said how I wrote Can You Forgive Her after the plot of a play which had been rejected, which play had been called The Noble Jilt. Some year or two after the completion of the last chronicle, I was asked by the manager of a theatre to prepare a piece for his stage, and I did so, taking the plot of this novel. I called the comedy Did He Steal It? But my friend the manager did not approve of my attempt. My mind at this time was less attentive to such a matter than when dear old George Bartley nearly crushed me by his criticism, so that I forget the reason given. I have little doubt but that the manager was right. That he intended to express a true opinion, and would have been glad to have taken the piece, had he thought it suitable, I am quite sure. I have sometimes wished to see during my lifetime a combined republication of those tales which are occupied with the fictitious county of Barsetshire. These would be The Warden, Barchester Towers, Doctor Thorne, Framley Parsonage, and The Last Chronicle of Barset. But I have hitherto failed. The copyrights are in the hands of 4 different persons, including myself, and with one of the 4 I have not been able to prevail to act in concert with the others. Since this was written I have made arrangements for doing as I have wished, and the first volume of the series will now very shortly be published. In 1867 I made up my mind to take a step in life which was not unattended with peril, which many would call rash, and which, when taken, I should be sure at some period to regret. This step was the resignation of my place at the Post Office. I have described how it was that I contrived to combine the performance of its duties with my other avocations in life. I got up always very early, but even this did not suffice. I worked always on Sundays, as to which no scruple of religion made me unhappy, and not unfrequently I was driven to work at night. In the winter, when hunting was going on, I had to keep myself very much on the alert. And during the London season, when I was generally 2 or 3 days of the week in town, I found the official work to be a burden. I had determined some years previously, after due consideration with my wife, to abandon the Post Office when I had put by an income equal to the pension to which I should be entitled if I remained in the department till I was 60. That I had now done, and I sighed for liberty. The exact time chosen, the autumn of 1867, was selected because I was then about to undertake other literary work in editing a new magazine, of which I shall speak very shortly. But in addition to these reasons there was another, which was, I think, at last the actuating cause. When Sir Rowland Hill left the Post Office, and my brother-in-law Mr. Tilley became secretary in his place, I applied for the vacant office of Under Secretary. Had I obtained this, I should have given up my hunting, have given up much of my literary work, at any rate would have edited no magazine, and would have returned to the habit of my youth in going daily to the General Post Office. There was very much against such a change in life. The increase of salary would not have amounted to above £400 a year, and I should have lost much more than that in literary remuneration. I should have felt bitterly the slavery of attendance at an office from which I had then been exempt for 25 years. I should, too, have greatly missed the sport which I loved. But I was attached to the department, had imbued myself with a thorough love of letters, I mean the letters which are carried by the post, and was anxious for their welfare as though they were all my own. In short, I wished to continue the connection. I did not wish, moreover, that any younger officer should again pass over my head. I believed that I had been a valuable public servant, and I will own to a feeling existing at that time that I had not altogether been well treated. I was probably wrong in this. I had been allowed to hunt, and to do as I pleased, and to say what I liked, and had in that way received my reward. I applied for the office, but Mr. Scudamore was appointed to it. He no doubt was possessed of gifts which I did not possess. He understood the manipulation of money and the use of figures, and was a great accountant. I think that I might have been more useful in regard to the labours and wages of the immense body of men employed by the Post Office. However, Mr. Scudamore was appointed, and I made up my mind that I would fall back upon my old intention and leave the department. I think I allowed 2 years to pass before I took the step, and the day on which I sent the letter was to me most melancholy. The rule of the service in regard to pensions is very just. A man shall serve till he is 60 before he is entitled to a pension, unless his health fail him. At that age he is entitled to 1/60th of his salary for every year he has served up to 40 years. If his health do fail him so that he is unfit for further work before the age named, then he may go with a pension amounting to 1/60th for every year he has served. I could not say that my health had failed me, and therefore I went without any pension. I have since felt occasionally that it has been supposed that I left the Post Office under pressure, because I attended to hunting and to my literary work rather than to postal matters. As it had for many years been my ambition to be a thoroughly good servant to the public, and to give to the public much more than I took in the shape of salary, this feeling has sometimes annoyed me. And as I am still a little sore on the subject, and as I would not have it imagined after my death that I had slighted the public service to which I belonged, I will venture here to give the reply which was sent to the letter containing my resignation. General Post Office, October 9th, 1867. Sir, I have received your letter of the 3rd this month, in which you tender your resignation as Surveyor in the Post Office service, and state as your reason for this step that you have adopted another profession, the exigencies of which are so great as to make you feel you cannot give to the duties of the Post Office that amount of attention which you consider the Postmaster General has a right to expect. You have for many years ranked among the most conspicuous members of the Post Office, which, on several occasions, when you have been employed on large and difficult matters, has reaped much benefit from the great abilities which you have been able to place at its disposal. And in mentioning this, I have been especially glad to record that, notwithstanding the many calls upon your time, you have never permitted your other avocations to interfere with your Post Office work, which has been faithfully and indeed energetically performed. There was a touch of irony in this word energetically, but it still did not displease me. In accepting your resignation, which he does with much regret, the Duke of Montrose desires me to convey to you his own sense of the value of your services, and to state how alive he is to the loss which will be sustained by the department in which you have long been an ornament, and where your place will with difficulty be replaced. Signed, J. Tilley. Readers will no doubt think that this is official flummery, and so in fact it is. I do not at all imagine that I was an ornament to the Post Office, and have no doubt that the secretaries and assistant secretaries very often would have been glad to be rid of me, but the letter may be taken as evidence that I did not allow my literary enterprises to interfere with my official work. A man who takes public money without earning it is to me so odious that I can find no pardon for him in my heart. I have known many such, and some who have craved the power to do so. Nothing would annoy me more than to think that I should even be supposed to have been among the number. And so my connection was dissolved with the department to which I had applied the 33 best years of my life. I must not say devoted, for devotion implies an entire surrender, and I certainly had found time for other occupations. It is, however, absolutely true that during all those years I had thought very much more about the Post Office than I had of my literary work, and had given to it a more unflagging attention. Up to this time I had never been angry, never felt myself injured or unappreciated in that my literary efforts were slighted. But I had suffered very much bitterness on that score in reference to the Post Office, and I had suffered not only on my own personal behalf, but also, and more bitterly, when I could not promise to be done the things which I thought ought to be done for the benefits of others. That the public in little villages should be enabled to buy postage stamps, that they should have their letters delivered free and at an early hour, that pillar letter boxes should be put up for them, of which accommodation in the streets and ways of England I was the originator, having, however, got the authority for the erection of the first at St. Heliers in Jersey; that the letter carriers and sorters should not be overworked; that they should be adequately paid and have some hours to themselves, especially on Sundays; above all, that they should be made to earn their wages, and latterly that they should not be crushed by what I thought to be the damnable system of so called merit. These were the matters by which I was stirred to what the secretary was pleased to call energetic performance of my duties. How I loved when I was contradicted, as I was very often, and no doubt very properly, to do instantly as I was bid, and then to prove that what I was doing was fatuous, dishonest, expensive, and impracticable. And then there were feuds, such delicious feuds. I was always an anti-Hillite, acknowledging indeed the great thing which Sir Rowland Hill had done for the country, but believing him to be entirely unfit to manage men or to arrange labour. It was a pleasure to me to differ from him on all occasions, and looking back now I think that in all such differences I was right. Having so steeped myself, as it were, in postal waters, I could not go out from them without a regret. I wonder whether I did anything to improve the style of writing in official reports. I strove to do so gallantly, never being contented with the language of my own reports unless it seemed to have been so written as to be pleasant to be read. I took extreme delight in writing them, not allowing myself to recopy them, never having them recopied by others, but sending them up with their original blots and erasures, if blots and erasures there were. It is hardly manly, I think, that a man should search after a fine neatness at the expense of so much waste labour, or that he should not be able to exact from himself the necessity of writing words in the form in which they should be read. If a copy be required, let it be taken afterwards, by hand or by machine, as may be; but the writer of a letter, if he wish his words to prevail with the reader, should send them out as written by himself, by his own hand, with his own marks, his own punctuation, correct or incorrect, with the evidence upon them that they have come from out of his own mind. And so the cord was cut, and I was a free man to run about the world where I would. A little before the date of my resignation, Mr. James Virtue, the printer and publisher, had asked me to edit a new magazine for him, and had offered me a salary of £1000 a year for the work, over and above what might be due to me for my own contributions. I had known something of magazines, and did not believe that they were generally very lucrative. They were, I thought, useful to some publishers as bringing grist to the mill, but as Mr. Virtue's business was chiefly that of a printer, in which he was very successful, this consideration could hardly have had much weight with him. I very strongly advised him to abandon the project, pointing out to him that a large expenditure would be necessary to carry on the magazine in accordance with my views, that I could not be concerned in it on any other understanding, and that the chances of an adequate return to him of his money were very small. He came down to Waltham, listened to my arguments with great patience, and then told me that if I would not do the work he would find some other editor. Upon this I consented to undertake the duty. My terms as to salary were those which he had himself proposed. The special stipulations which I demanded were, firstly, that I should put whatever I pleased into the magazine, or keep whatever I pleased out of it, without interference; secondly, that I should from month to month give in to him a list of payments to be made to contributors, and that he should pay them, allowing me to fix the amounts; and thirdly, that the arrangement should remain in force at any rate for 2 years. To all this he made no objection, and during the time that he and I were thus bound together he not only complied with these stipulations, but also with every suggestion respecting the magazine that I made to him. If the use of large capital, combined with wide liberality and absolute confidence on the part of the proprietor, and perpetual good humour, would have produced success, our magazine certainly would have succeeded. In all such enterprises the name is the first difficulty. There is the name which has a meaning, and the name which has none; of which two the name that has none is certainly the better, as it never belies itself. The Liberal may cease to be Liberal, or the Fortnightly, alas, to come out once a fortnight; but the Cornhill and the Argosy are under any set of circumstances as well adapted to these names as under any other. Then there is the proprietary name, or possibly the editorial name, which is only amiss because the publication may change hands. Blackwood's has indeed always remained Blackwood's, and Fraser's, though it has been bought and sold, still does not sound amiss. Mr. Virtue, fearing the too attractive qualities of his own name, wished the magazine to be called Anthony Trollope's, but to this I objected eagerly. There were then about the town, still are about the town, 2 or 3 literary gentlemen, by whom to have had myself editored would have driven me in exile from my country. After much discussion we settled on St. Paul's as the name for our bantling, not as being in any way new, but as enabling it to fall easily into the ranks with many others. If we were to make ourselves in any way peculiar, it was not by our name that we were desirous of doing so. I do not think that we did make ourselves in any way peculiar, and yet there was a great struggle made. On the part of the proprietor I may say that money was spent very freely. On my own part I may declare that I admitted nothing which I thought might tend to success. I read all manuscripts sent to me, and endeavoured to judge impartially. I succeeded in obtaining the services of an excellent literary corps. During the 3 years and a half of my editorship I was assisted by Mr. Goschen, Captain Brackenbury, Edward Dicey, Percy Fitzgerald, H. A. Layard, Allingham, Leslie Stephen, Mrs. Lynn Linton, my brother T.A. Trollope and his wife, Charles Lever, E. Arnold, Austin Dobson, R.A. Proctor, Lady Pollock, G.H. Lewes, C. Mackey, Hardman of the Times, George MacDonald, W.R. Gregg, Mrs. Oliphant, Sir Charles Trevelyan, Leonie Levi, Dutton Cook, and others whose names would make the list too long. It might have been thought that with such aid the St. Paul's would have succeeded. I do not think that the failure, for it did fail, arose from bad editing. Perhaps too much editing might have been the fault. I was too anxious to be good, and did not enough think of what might be lucrative. It did fail, for it never paid its way. It reached, if I remember right, a circulation of nearly 10,000, perhaps on one or two occasions may have gone beyond that. But the enterprise had been set on foot on a system too expensive to be made lucrative by anything short of a very large circulation. Literary merit will hardly set a magazine afloat, though when afloat it will sustain it. Time is wanted, or the hubbub and flurry and excitement created by ubiquitous sesquipedalian advertisement. Merit and time together may be effective, but they must be backed by economy and patience. I think, upon the whole, that publishers themselves have been the best editors of magazines, when they have been able to give time and intelligence to the work. Nothing certainly has ever been done better than Blackwood's. The Cornhill, too, after Thackeray had left it and before Leslie Stephen had taken it, seemed to be in quite efficient hands, those hands being the hands of proprietor and publisher. The proprietor, at any rate, knows what he wants and what he can afford, and is not so frequently tempted to fall into that worst of literary quicksands, the publishing of matter not for the sake of the readers but for that of the writer. I did not so sin very often, but often enough feel that I was a coward. My dear friend, this is trash! It is so hard to speak thus, but so necessary for an editor. We all remember the thorn in his pillow of which Thackeray complained. Occasionally I know that I did give way on behalf of some literary aspirant whose work did not represent itself to me as being good. And as often as I did so, I broke my trust to those who employed me. Now I think that such editors as Thackeray and myself, if I may for the moment be allowed to couple men so unequal, will always be liable to commit such faults, but that the natures of publishers and proprietors will be less soft. Nor do I know why the pages of a magazine should be considered to be open to any aspirant who thinks that he can write an article, or why the manager of a magazine should be doomed to read all that may be sent to him. The object of the proprietor is to produce a periodical that shall satisfy the public, which he may probably best do by securing the services of writers of acknowledged ability. End of Chapter 15. Recording by Jessica Louise, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Chapter 16 of the Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. Beverley. Very early in life, very soon after I had become a clerk in St. Martin's le Grand, when I was utterly impecunious and beginning to fall grievously into debt, I was asked by an uncle of mine, who was himself a clerk in the War Office, what destination I should like best for my future life. He probably meant to inquire whether I wished to live married or single, whether to remain in the Post Office or to leave it, whether I should prefer the town or the country. I replied that I should like to be Member of Parliament. My uncle, who was given to sarcasm, rejoined that, as far he knew, few clerks in the Post Office did become Members of Parliament. I think it was the remembrance of this jeer which stirred me up to look for a seat as soon as I had made myself capable of holding one by leaving the public service. My uncle was dead, but if I could get a seat, the knowledge that I had done so might travel to that bourne from whence he was not likely to return, and he might there feel that he had done me wrong. Independently of this, I have always thought that to sit in the British Parliament should be the highest object of ambition to every educated Englishman.
I do not by this mean to suggest that every educated Englishman should set before himself a seat in Parliament as a probable or even a possible career, but that the man in Parliament has reached a higher position than the man out; that to serve one's country without pay is the grandest work that a man can do; that of all studies the study of politics is the one in which a man may make himself most useful to his fellow creatures; and that of all lives, public political lives are capable of the highest efforts. So thinking, though I was aware that 53 was too late an age at which to commence a new career, I resolved with much hesitation that I would make the attempt. Writing now at an age beyond 60, I can say that my political feelings and convictions have never undergone any change. They are now what they became when I first began to have political feelings and convictions. Nor do I find in myself any tendency to modify them, as I have found generally in men as they grow old. I consider myself to be an advanced, but still a conservative Liberal, which I regard not only as a possible but as a rational and consistent phase of political existence. I can, I believe, in a very few words, make known my political theory; and as I am anxious that any who know aught of me should know that, I will endeavour to do so. It must, I think, be painful to all men to feel inferiority. It should, I think, be a matter of some pain to all men to feel superiority, unless when it has been won by their own efforts. We do not understand the operations of Almighty wisdom, and are therefore unable to tell the causes of the terrible inequalities that we see. Why some, why so many, should have so little to make life enjoyable, so much to make it painful, while a few others, not through their own merit, have had gifts poured out to them from a full hand. We acknowledge the hand of God and His wisdom, but still we are struck with awe and horror at the misery of many of our brethren. We who have been born to the superior condition, for in this matter I consider myself to be standing on a platform with dukes and princes, and all others to whom plenty and education and liberty have been given, cannot, I think, look upon the inane, unintellectual, and tossed-bound life of those who cannot even feed themselves sufficiently by their sweat, without some feeling of injustice, some feeling of pain. This consciousness of wrong has induced in many enthusiastic but unbalanced minds a desire to set all things right by a proclaimed equality. In their efforts such men have shown how powerless they are in opposing the ordinances of the Creator. For the mind of the thinker and the student is driven to admit, though it be awestruck by apparent injustice, that this inequality is the work of God. Make all men equal to day, and God has so created them that they shall be unequal to morrow. The so-called conservative, the conscientious philanthropic conservative, seeing this, and being surely convinced that such inequalities are of divine origin, tells himself that it is his duty to preserve them. He thinks that the preservation of the welfare of the world depends on the maintenance of those distances between the prince and the peasant by which he finds himself to be surrounded; and perhaps I may add that the duty is not unpleasant, as he feels himself to be one of the princes. But this man, though he sees something, and sees that very clearly, sees only a little. The divine inequality is apparent to him, but not the equally divine diminution of that inequality. That such diminution is taking place on all sides is apparent enough, but it is apparent to him as an evil, the consummation of which it is his duty to retard. He cannot prevent it, and therefore the society to which he belongs is in his eyes retrograding. He will even at times assist it, and will do so conscientiously, feeling that under the gentle pressure supplied by him, and with the drags and holdfasts which he may add, the movement would be slower than it would become if subjected to his proclaimed and absolute opponents. Such, I think, are conservatives; and I speak of men who, with the fear of God before their eyes, and their love of their neighbours warm in their hearts, endeavour to do their duty to the best of their ability. Using the term which is now common, and which will be best understood, I will endeavour to explain how the equally conscientious Liberal is opposed to the Conservative. He is equally aware that these distances are of divine origin, equally averse to any sudden disruption of society in quest of some utopian blessedness. But he is alive to the fact that these distances are day by day becoming less, and he regards this continual diminution as a series of steps towards that human millennium of which he dreams. He is even willing to help the many to ascend the ladder a little, though he knows, as they come up towards him, he must go down to meet them. What is really in his mind is, I will not say equality, for the word is offensive, and presents to the imagination of men ideas of communism, of ruin, and insane democracy, but a tendency towards equality. In following that, however, he knows that he must be hemmed in by safeguards, lest he be tempted to travel too quickly; and therefore he is glad to be accompanied on his way by the repressive action of a Conservative opponent. Holding such views, I think I am guilty of no absurdity in calling myself an advanced Conservative Liberal. A man who entertains in his mind any political doctrine, except as a means of improving the condition of his fellows, I regard as a political intriguer, a charlatan, and a conjurer, as one who thinks that by a certain amount of wary wire pulling he may raise himself in the estimation of the world. I am aware that this theory of politics will seem to many to be stilted, overstrained, and, as the Americans would say, highfalutin. Many will declare that the majority even of those who call themselves politicians, perhaps even of those who take an active part in politics, are stirred by no such feelings as these, and acknowledge no such motives. Men become Tories or Whigs, Liberals or Conservatives, partly by education, following their fathers, partly by chance, partly as openings come, partly in accordance with the bent of their minds, but still without any far-fetched reasonings as to distances and the diminution of distances. No doubt it is so, and in the battle of politics as it goes, men are led further and further away from first causes, till at last a measure is opposed by one simply because it is advocated by another, and members of Parliament swarm into lobbies, following the dictation of their leaders, and not their own individual judgments. But the principle is at work throughout. To many, though hardly acknowledged, it is still apparent. On almost all it has its effect, though there are the intriguers, the clever conjurers, to whom politics is simply such a game as is billiards or rackets, only played with greater results. To the minds that create and lead and sway political opinion, some such theory is, I think, ever present. The truth of all this I had long since taken home to myself. I had now been thinking of it for 30 years, and had never doubted. But I had always been aware of a certain visionary weakness about myself in regard to politics. A man, to be useful in Parliament, must be able to confine himself and conform himself, to be satisfied with doing a little bit of a little thing at a time. He must patiently get up everything connected with the duty on mushrooms, and then be satisfied with himself when at last he has induced a Chancellor of the Exchequer to say that he will consider the impost at the first opportunity. He must be content to be beaten 6 times in order that on a 7th his work may be found to be of assistance to some one else. He must remember that he is 1 out of 650, and be content with 1/650th part of the attention of the nation. If he have grand ideas, he must keep them to himself, unless by chance he can work his way up to the top of the tree. In short, he must be a practical man. Now I knew that in politics I could never become a practical man. I should never be satisfied with a soft word from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, but would always be flinging my overtaxed ketchup in his face. Nor did it seem to me to be possible that I should ever become a good speaker. I had no special gifts that way, and had not studied the art early enough in life to overcome natural difficulties. I had found that with infinite labour I could learn a few sentences by heart, and deliver them, monotonously indeed, but clearly. Or again, if there were something special to be said, I could say it in a commonplace fashion, but always as though I were in a hurry, and with the fear before me of being thought to be a prolix. But I had no power of combining, as a public speaker should always do, that which I had studied with that which occurred to me at the moment. It must be all lesson, which I found to be best, or else all impromptu, which was very bad indeed, unless I had something special on my mind. I was thus aware that I could do no good by going into Parliament, that the time for it, if there could have been a time, had gone by. But still I had an almost insane desire to sit there, and be able to assure myself that my uncle's scorn had not been deserved. In 1867 it had been suggested to me that in the event of a dissolution I should stand for one division of the county of Essex; and I had promised that I would do so, though the promise at that time was as rash a one as a man could make. I was instigated to this by the late Charles Buxton, a man whom I greatly loved, and who was very anxious that the county for which his brother had sat, and with which the family were connected, should be relieved from what he regarded as the thraldom of Toryism. But there was no dissolution then. Mr. Disraeli passed his Reform Bill by the help of the Liberal member for Newark, and the summoning of a new Parliament was postponed till the next year. By this new Reform Bill Essex was portioned out into 3 instead of 2 electoral divisions, one of which, that adjacent to London, would, it was thought, be altogether Liberal. After the promise which I had given, the performance of which would have cost me a large sum of money absolutely in vain, it was felt by some that I should be selected as one of the candidates for the new division, and as such I was proposed by Mr. Charles Buxton. But another gentleman, who would have been bound by previous pledges to support me, was put forward by what I believe to have been the defeating interest, and I had to give way. At the election this gentleman, with another Liberal, who had often stood for the county, was returned without a contest. Alas, alas! They were both unseated at the next election, when the great Conservative reaction took place. In the spring of 1868 I was sent to the United States on a postal mission, of which I will speak presently. While I was absent the dissolution took place. On my return I was somewhat too late to look out for a seat, but I had friends who knew the weakness of my ambition, and it was not likely therefore that I should escape the peril of being put forward for some impossible borough, as to which the Liberal party would not choose that it should go to the Conservatives without a struggle. At last, after 1 or 2 others, Beverley was proposed to me, and to Beverley I went. I must, however, exculpate the gentleman who acted as my agent from undue persuasion exercised towards me. He was a man who thoroughly understood Parliament, having sat there himself, and he sits there now at this moment. He understood Yorkshire, or at least the East Riding of Yorkshire, in which Beverley is situated, certainly better than any one alive. He understood all the mysteries of canvassing, and he knew well the traditions, the condition, and the prospect of the Liberal party. I will not give his name, but they who knew Yorkshire in 1868 will not be at a loss to find it. "So," said he, "you are going to stand for Beverley?" I replied gravely that I was thinking of doing so. "You don't expect to get in?" he said. Again I was grave. I would not, I said, be sanguine, but nevertheless I was disposed to hope for the best. "Oh no," continued he, with good humoured raillery, "you won't get in. I don't suppose you really expect it. But there is a fine career open to you. You will spend 1,000, and lose the election. Then you will petition and spend another 1,000. You will throw out the elected members. There will be a commission, and the borough will be disfranchised. For a beginner such as you are, that will be a great success." And yet in the teeth of this, from a man who knew all about it, I persisted in going to Beverley. The borough, which returned 2 members, had long been represented by Sir Henry Edwards, of whom I think I am justified in saying that he had contracted a close intimacy with it for the sake of the seat. There had been many contests, many petitions, many void elections, many members, but through it all Sir Henry had kept his seat, if not with permanence, yet with a fixity of tenure next door to permanence. I fancy that with a little management between the parties, the borough might at this time have returned a member of each colour quietly; But there were spirits there who did not love political quietude, and it was at last decided that there should be 2 Liberal and 2 Conservative candidates. Sir Henry was joined by a young man of fortune in quest of a seat, and I was grouped with Mr. Maxwell, the eldest son of Lord Herries, a Scotch Roman Catholic peer who lives in the neighbourhood. When the time came I went down to canvass, and spent, I think, the most wretched fortnight of my manhood. In the first place I was subject to a bitter tyranny from grinding vulgar tyrants. They were doing what they could, or said that they were doing so, to secure me a seat in Parliament, and I was to be in their hands, at any rate, the period of my candidature. On one day both of us, Mr. Maxwell and I, wanted to go out hunting. We proposed to ourselves but the one holiday during this period of intense labour; but I was assured, as was he also, by a publican who was working for us, that if we committed such a crime, he and all Beverley would desert us. From morning to evening every day I was taken round the lanes and byways of that uninteresting town, canvassing every voter, exposed to the rain, up to my knees in slush, and utterly unable to assume that air of triumphant joy with which a jolly successful candidate should be invested. At night, every night I had to speak somewhere, which was bad, and to listen to the speaking of others, which was much worse. When, on one Sunday, I proposed to go to the Minster Church, I was told that was quite useless, as the Church party were all certain to support Sir Henry. "Indeed," said the publican, my tyrant, "he goes there in a kind of official profession, and you'd better not allow yourself to be seen in the same place." So I stayed away and omitted my prayers. No Church of England church in Beverley would on such an occasion have welcomed a Liberal candidate. I felt myself to be a kind of pariah in the borough, to whom was opposed all that was pretty, and all that was nice, and all that was ostensibly good. But perhaps my strongest sense of discomfort arose from the conviction that my political ideas were all leather and prunella to the men whose votes I was soliciting. They cared nothing for my doctrines, and could not be made to understand that I should have any. I had been brought to Beverley either to beat Sir Henry Edwards, which, however, no one probably thought to be feasible, or to cause him the greatest possible amount of trouble, inconvenience, and expense. There were, indeed, 2 points on which a portion of my wished for supporters seemed to have opinions, and on both these points I was driven by my opinions to oppose them. Some were anxious for the ballot, which had not then become law, and some desired the Permissive Bill. I hated, and do hate, both these measures, thinking it to be unworthy of a great people to free itself from the evil results of vicious conduct by unmanly restraints. Undue influence on voters is a great evil from which this country had already done much to emancipate itself by extending electoral divisions, and by an increase of independent feeling. These, I thought, and not secret voting, were the weapons by which electoral intimidation should be overcome. And as for drink, I believe in no parliamentary restraint, but I do believe in the gradual effect of moral teaching and education. But a Liberal, to do any good at Beverley, should have been able to swallow such gnats as those. I would swallow nothing, and was altogether the wrong man. I knew from the commencement of my candidature how it would be. Of course that well-trained gentleman who condescended to act as my agent had understood the case, and I ought to have taken his thoroughly kind advice. He had seen it all, and had told himself that it was wrong that one so innocent in such ways as I, so utterly unable to fight such a battle, should be carried down into Yorkshire merely to spend money and to be annoyed. He could not have said more than he did say, and I suffered for my obstinacy. Of course I was not elected. Sir Henry Edwards and his comrade became members for Beverley, and I was at the bottom of the poll. I paid £400 for my expenses, and then returned to London. My friendly agent, in his raillery, had of course exaggerated the cost. He had, when I arrived at Beverley, asked me for a cheque for £400, and told me that the sum would suffice. It did suffice. How it came to pass that exactly that sum should be required, I never knew, but such was the case. Then there came a petition, not from me but from the town. The inquiry was made, and 2 gentlemen were unseated. The borough was disfranchised. Sir Henry Edwards was put on his trial for some kind of parliamentary offence, and was acquitted. In this way Beverley's privilege as a borough and my parliamentary ambition were brought to an end at the same time. When I knew the result I did not altogether regret it. It may be that Beverley might have been brought to political confusion, and Sir Henry Edwards relegated to private life without the expenditure of my hard-earned money, and without that fortnight of misery. But, connecting the things together, as it was natural that I should do, I did flatter myself that I had done some good. It had seemed to me that nothing could be worse, nothing more unpatriotic, nothing more absolutely opposed to the system of representative government, than the time-honoured practices of the borough of Beverley. It had come to pass that political cleanliness was odious to the citizens. There was something grand in the scorn with which a leading Liberal there turned up his nose at me when I told him that there should be no bribery, no treating, not even a pot of beer on one side. It was a matter for study to see how at Beverley politics were appreciated because they might subserve electoral purposes, and how little it was understood that electoral purposes, which are in themselves a nuisance, should be endured in order that they may subserve politics. And then the time, the money, the mental energy which had been expended in making the borough a secure seat for a gentleman who had realised the idea that it would become him to be a member of Parliament. This use of the borough seemed to be realised and approved in the borough generally. The inhabitants had taught themselves to think that it was for such purposes that boroughs were intended. To have assisted in putting an end to this, even in one town, was to a certain extent a satisfaction. End of Chapter 16. Recording by Jessica Louise, Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Chapter 17 of the Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. The American Postal Treaty. The Question of Copyright with America. 4 more novels. In the spring of 1868, before the affair of Beverley, which, as being the first direct result of my resignation of office, has been brought in a little out of its turn, I was requested to go over to the United States and make a postal treaty at Washington. This, as I had left the service, I regarded as a compliment, and of course I went. It was my 3rd visit to America, and I have made 2 since. As far as the Post Office work was concerned, it was very far from being agreeable. I found myself located at Washington, a place I do not love, and was harassed by delays, annoyed by incompetence, and opposed by what I felt to be personal and not national views. I had to deal with 2 men, with one who was a working officer of the American Post Office, than whom I have never met a more zealous, or, as far as I could judge, a more honest public servant. He had his views, and I had mine, each of us having at heart the welfare of the service in regard to his own country, each of us also having certain orders which we were bound to obey. But the other gentleman, who was in rank the superior, whose executive position was dependent on his official status, as is the case with our own ministers, did not recommend himself to me equally. He would make appointments with me and then not keep them, which at last offended me so grievously that I declared at the Washington Post Office that if this treatment were continued, I would write home to say that any further action on my part was impossible. I think I should have done so had it not occurred to me that I might in this way serve his purpose rather than my own, or the purposes of those who had sent me. The treaty, however, was at last made, the purport of which was that everything possible should be done, at a heavy expenditure on the part of England, to expedite the mails from England to America, and that nothing should be done by America to expedite the mails from thence to us. The expedition I believe to be now equal both ways, but it could not be maintained as it is without the payment of a heavy subsidy from Great Britain, whereas no subsidy is paid by the States. This was a state of things which may probably have appeared to American politicians to be exactly that which they should try to obtain. The whole arrangement has again been altered since the time of which I have spoken. I had also a commission from the Foreign Office, for which I had asked, to make an effort on behalf of an international copyright between the United States and Great Britain, the want of which is the one great impediment to pecuniary success which still stands in the way of successful English authors. I cannot say that I have never had a shilling of American money on behalf of reprints of my work, but I have been conscious of no such payment. Having found many years ago, in 1861, when I made a struggle on the subject, being then in the States, the details of which are sufficiently amusing. *[* In answer to a question from myself, a certain American publisher, he who usually reprinted my works, promised me that "if any other American publisher republished my work on America before he had done so, he would not bring out a competing edition, though there would be no law to hinder him." I then entered into an agreement with another American publisher, stipulating to supply him with early sheets, and he stipulating to supply me a certain royalty on his sales, with accounts half yearly. I sent the sheets with energetic punctuality, and the work was brought out with equal energy and precision by my old American publishers. The gentleman who made the promise had not broken his word. No other American edition had come out before his. I never got any account, and of course never received $1. That I could not myself succeed in dealing with American booksellers, I have sold all foreign right to the English publishers; and though I do not know that I have raised my price against them on that score, I may in this way have had some indirect advantage from the American market. But I do know that what the publishers have received here is very trifling. I doubt whether Messrs. Chapman & Hall, my present publishers, get for early sheets sent to the States as much as 5 per cent. On the price they pay me for my manuscript. But the American readers are more numerous than the English, and taking them all through are probably more wealthy. If I can get 1,000 for a book here, exclusive of their market, I ought to be able to get as much there. If a man supply 600 customers with shoes in place of 300, there is no question as to such result. Why not, then, if I can supply 60,000 readers instead of 30,000? I fancied that I knew that the opposition to an international copyright was by no means an American feeling, but was confined to the bosoms of a few interested Americans. All that I did and heard in reference to the subject on this further visit, and having a certain authority from the British Secretary of State with me I could hear and do something, altogether confirmed me in this view. I have no doubt that if I could poll American readers, or American senators, or even American representatives, if the polling could be unbiased, or American booksellers, I might also say American publishers, if I might count them by the number of heads and not by the amount of work done by the firms, that an assent to an international copyright would be the result. The state of things as it is crushing to American authors, as the publishers will not pay them a liberal scale, knowing that they can supply their customers with modern English literature without paying for it. The English amount of production so much exceeds the American, that the rate at which the former can be published rules the market. It is equally injurious to American booksellers, except to 2 or 3 of the greatest houses. No small man can now acquire the exclusive right of printing and selling an English book. If such a one attempt it, the work is printed instantly by one of the leviathans, who alone are the gainers. The argument, of course, is that the American readers are the gainers; that as they can get for nothing the use of certain property, they would be cutting their own throats were they to pass a law debarring themselves from the power of such appropriation. In this argument all idea of honesty is thrown to the winds. It is not that they do not approve of a system of copyright, as many great men have disapproved, for their own law of copyright is as stringent as ours. A bold assertion is made that they like to appropriate the goods of other people, and that as in this case they can do so with impunity, they will continue to do so. But the argument, as far as I have been able to judge, comes not from the people but from the bookselling leviathans, and from those politicians whom the leviathans are able to attach to their interests. The ordinary American purchaser is not much affected by slight variations in price.
He is at any rate too high-hearted to be affected by the prospect of such variation. It is the man who wants to make money, not he who fears that he may be called upon to spend it, who controls such matters as this in the United States. It is the large speculator who becomes powerful in the lobbies of the House, and understands how wise it may be to incur a great expenditure either in the creation of a great business, or in protecting that which he has created from competition. Nothing was done in 1868, and nothing has been done since, up to 1876. A Royal Commission on the law of copyright is now about to sit in this country, of which I have consented to be a member, and the question must then be handled, though nothing done by a Royal Commission here can affect American legislators. But I do believe that if the measure be consistently and judiciously urged, the enemies to it in the States will gradually be overcome. Some years since we had some quasi-private meetings, under the presidency of Lord Stanhope, in Mr. John Murray's dining room, on the subject of international copyright. At one of these I discussed this matter of American international copyright with Charles Dickens, who strongly declared his conviction that nothing would induce an American to give up the power he possesses of pirating British literature. But he was a man who, seeing clearly what was before him, would not realise the possibility of shifting views. Because in this matter the American decision had been, according to his thinking, dishonest, therefore no other than dishonest decision was to be expected from Americans. Against that idea I protested, and now protest. American dishonesty is rampant, but it is rampant only among a few. It is the great misfortune of the community that those few have been able to dominate so large a portion of the population among which all men can vote, but so few can understand for what they are voting. Since this was written, the Commission on the Law of Copyright has sat and made its report. With the great body of it I agree, and could serve no reader by alluding here at length to matters which are discussed there. But in regard to this question of international copyright with the United States, I think that we were incorrect in the expression of an opinion that fair justice, or justice approaching to fairness, is now done by American publishers to English authors by payments made by them for early sheets. I have just found that 20 was paid to my publisher in England for the use of the early sheets of a novel for which I received 1600 in England. When asked why he accepted so little, he assured me that the firm with whom he dealt would not give more. Why not go to another firm? I asked. No other firm would give $1, because no other firm would care to run counter to that great firm which had assumed to itself the right of publishing my books. I soon after received a copy of my own novel in the American form, and found that it was published for 7½d. That a great sale was expected can be argued from the fact that without a great sale the paper and printing necessary for the republication of a 3-volume novel could not be supplied. Many thousand copies must have been sold, but from these the author received not 1 shilling. I need hardly point out that the sum of 20 would not do more than compensate the publisher for his trouble in making the bargain. The publisher here no doubt might have refused to supply the early sheets, but he had no means of exacting a higher price than that offered. I mention the circumstance here because it has been boasted, on behalf of the American publishers, that though there is no international copyright, they deal so liberally with English authors as to make it unnecessary that the English author should be so protected. With the fact of the 20 just brought to my knowledge, and with the copy of my book published at 7½d now in my hands, I feel that an international copyright is very necessary for my protection. They among Englishmen who best love and most admire the United States have felt themselves tempted to use the strongest language in denouncing the sins of Americans. Who can but love their personal generosity, their active and far-seeking philanthropy, their love of education, their hatred of ignorance, the general convictions of the minds of all of them that a man should be enabled to walk upright, fearing no one, and conscious that he is responsible for his own actions?
In what country have grander efforts been made by private munificence to relieve the sufferings of humanity? Where can the English traveller find any more anxious to assist him than the normal American, when once the American shall have found the Englishman to be neither sullen nor fastidious? Who, lastly, is so much an object of heartfelt admiration of the American man and the American woman as the well-mannered and well-educated Englishwoman or Englishman? These are the ideas which I say spring uppermost in the minds of the unprejudiced English traveller as he makes acquaintance with these near relatives. Then he becomes cognisant of their official doings, of their politics, of their municipal scandals, of their great ring robberies, of their lobbyings and briberies, and the infinite baseness of their public life. There are, at the top of everything he finds, the very men who are the least fit to occupy high places. American public dishonesty is so glaring that the very friends he has made in the country are not slow to acknowledge it, speaking of public life as a thing apart from their own existence, as a state of dirt in which it would be an insult to suppose that they are concerned. In the midst of it all, the stranger, who sees so much that he hates and so much that he loves, hardly knows how to express himself. "It is not enough that you are personally clean," he says, with what energy and courage he can command, "not enough though the clean outnumber the foul as greatly as those gifted with eyesight outnumber the blind, if you that can see allow the blind to lead you. It is not by the private lives of the millions that the outside world will judge you, but by the public career of those units whose venality is allowed to debase the name of your country. There never was plainer proof given than is given here, that it is the duty of every honest citizen to look after the honour of his state." Personally, I have to own that I have met Americans, men, but more frequently women, who have in all respects come up to my ideas of what men and women should be: energetic, having opinions of their own, quick in speech, with some dash of sarcasm at their command, always intelligent, sweet to look at (I speak of the women), fond of pleasure, and each with a personality of his or her own which makes no effort necessary on my own part in remembering the difference between Mrs. Walker and Mrs. Green, or between Mr. Smith and Mr. Johnson. They have faults. They are self-conscious, and are too prone to prove by ill-concealed struggles that they are as good as you, whereas you perhaps have been long acknowledging to yourself that they are much better. And there is sometimes a pretence at personal dignity among those who think themselves to have risen high in the world which is deliciously ludicrous. I remember two old gentlemen, the owners of names which stand deservedly high in public estimation, whose deportment at a public funeral turned the occasion into one for irresistible comedy. They are suspicious at first, and fearful of themselves. They lack that simplicity of manners which with us has become a habit from our childhood. But they are never fools, and I think that they are seldom ill-natured. There is a woman, of whom not to speak in a work purporting to be a memoir of my own life would be to omit all allusion to one of the chief pleasures which has graced my later years. In the last 15 years she has been, out of my family, my most chosen friend. She is a ray of light to me, from which I can always strike a spark by thinking of her. I do not know that I should please her or do any good by naming her, but not to allude to her in these pages would amount almost to a falsehood. I could not write truly of myself without saying that such a friend had been vouchsafed to me. I trust she may live to read the words I have now written, and to wipe away a tear as she thinks of my feeling while I write them. I was absent on this occasion something over 3 months, and on my return I went back with energy to my work at the St. Paul's Magazine. The first novel in it from my own pen was called Phineas Finn, in which I commenced a series of semi-political tales. As I was debarred from expressing my opinions in the House of Commons, I took this method of declaring myself. And as I could not take my seat on those benches where I might possibly have been shone upon by the Speaker's eye, I had humbly to crave his permission for a seat in the gallery, so that I might thus become conversant with the ways and doings of the House in which some of my scenes were to be placed. The speaker was very gracious, and gave me a running order for, I think, a couple of months. It was enough, at any rate, to enable me often to be very tired, and, as I have been assured by members, to talk of the proceedings almost as well as though fortune had enabled me to fall asleep within the House itself. In writing Phineas Finn, and also some other novels which followed it, I was conscious that I could not make a tale pleasing chiefly, or perhaps in any part, by politics. If I write politics for my own sake, I must put in love and intrigue, social incidents, with perhaps a dash of sport, for the benefit of my readers. In this way I think I made my political hero interesting. It was certainly a blunder to take him from Ireland, into which I was led by the circumstance that I created the scheme of the book during a visit to Ireland. There was nothing to be gained by the peculiarity, and there was an added difficulty in obtaining sympathy and affection for a politician belonging to a nationality whose politics are not respected in England. But in spite of this, Phineas succeeded. It was not a brilliant success, because men and women not conversant with political matters could not care much for a hero who spent so much of his time either in the House of Commons or in a public office. But the men who would have lived with Phineas Finn read the book, and the women who would have lived with Lady Laura Standish read it also. As this was what I had intended, I was contented. It is all fairly good except the ending, as to which till I got to it I made no provision. As I fully intended to bring my hero again into the world, I was wrong to marry him to a simple pretty Irish girl, who could only be felt as an encumbrance on such return. When he did return I had no alternative but to kill the simple pretty Irish girl, which was an unpleasant and awkward necessity. In writing Phineas Finn I had constantly before me the necessity of progression in character, of marking the changes in men and women which would naturally be produced by the lapse of years. In most novels the writer can have no such duty, as the period occupied is not long enough to allow of the change of which I speak. In Ivanhoe, all the incidents of which are included in less than a month, the characters should be, as they are, consistent throughout. Novelists who have undertaken to write the life of a hero or heroine have generally considered their work completed at the interesting period of marriage, and have contented themselves with the advance in taste and manners which are common to all boys and girls as they become men and women. Fielding, no doubt, did more than this in Tom Jones, which is one of the greatest novels in the English language, for here he has shown how a noble and sanguine nature may fall away under temptation, and be again strengthened and made to stand upright. But I do not think that novelists have often set before themselves the state of progressive change. Nor should I have done it had I not found myself so frequently allured back to my old friends. So much of my inner life was passed in their company that I was continually asking myself how this woman would act when this or that event had passed over her head, or how that would carry himself when his youth had become manhood, or his manhood declined to old age. It was in regard to the old Duke of Omnium, of his nephew and heir, and of his heir's wife, Lady Glencora, that I was anxious to carry out this idea, but others added themselves to my mind as I went on, and I got round me a circle of persons as to whom I knew not only their present characters, but how those characters were to be affected by years and circumstances. The happy motherly life of Violet Effingham, which was due to the girl's honest but long restrained love. The tragic misery of Lady Laura, which was equally due to the sale she made of herself in her wretched marriage, and the long suffering but final success of the hero, of which he had deserved the first by his vanity, and the last by his constant honesty, had been foreshadowed to me from the first. As to the incidents of the story, the circumstances by which these personages were to be affected, I knew nothing. They were created for the most part as they were described. I never could arrange a set of events before me. But the evil and the good of my puppets, and how the evil would always lead to evil, and the good produce good, that was clear to me as the stars on a summer night. Lady Laura Standish is the best character in Phineas Finn, and its sequel Phineas Redux, of which I will speak here together. They are, in fact, but one novel, though they were brought out at a considerable interval of time and in different form. The first was commenced in the St. Paul's Magazine in 1867, and the other was brought out in the Graphic in 1873. In this there was much bad arrangement, as I had no right to expect that novel readers would remember the characters of a story after an interval of 6 years, or that any little interest which might have been taken in the career of my hero could then have been renewed. I do not know that such interest was renewed. But I found that the sequel enjoyed the same popularity as the former part, and among the same class of readers. Phineas and Lady Laura, and Lady Chiltern, as Violet had become, and the old Duke, whom I killed gracefully, and the new Duke, and the young Duchess, either kept their old friends or made new friends for themselves. Phineas Finn, I certainly think, was successful from first to last. I am aware, however, that there was nothing in it to touch the heart like the abasement of Lady Mason when confessing her guilt to her old lover, or any approach in delicacy of delineation to the character of Mr. Crawley. Phineas Finn, the first part of the story, was completed in May, 1867. In June and July I wrote Linda Tressel for Blackwood's Magazine, of which I have already spoken. In September and October I wrote a short novel called The Golden Lion of Grandpere, which was intended also for Blackwood, with a view of being published anonymously, but Mr. Blackwood did not find the arrangement to be profitable, and the story remained on my hands, unread and unthought of, for a few years. It appeared subsequently in Good Words. It was written on the model of Nina Balatka and Linda Tressel, but is very inferior to either of them. In November of the same year, 1867, I began a very long novel, which I called He Knew He Was Right, and which was brought out by Mr. Virtue, the proprietor of the St. Paul's Magazine, in sixpenny numbers every week. I do not know that in any literary effort I ever fell more completely short of my own intention than in this story. It was my purpose to create sympathy for the unfortunate man, who, while endeavouring to do his duty to all around him, should be led constantly astray by his unwillingness to submit his own judgment to the opinion of others. The man is made to be unfortunate enough, and the evil which he does is apparent. So far I did not fail, but the sympathy has not been created yet. I look upon the story as being nearly altogether bad. It is in part redeemed by certain scenes in the house and vicinity of an old maid in Exeter. But a novel which in its main parts is bad cannot in truth be redeemed by the vitality of subordinate characters. This work was finished while I was at Washington in the spring of 1868, and on the day after I finished it I commenced The Vicar of Bullhampton, a novel which I wrote for Messrs. Bradbury and Evans. This I completed in November 1868, and at once began Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite, a story which I was still writing at the close of the year. I look upon these 2 years, 1867 and 1868, of which I have given a somewhat confused account in this and the 2 preceding chapters, as the busiest of my life. I had indeed left the Post Office, but though I had left it I had been employed by it during a considerable portion of the time. I had established the St. Paul's Magazine, in reference to which I had read an enormous amount of manuscript, and for which, independently of my novels, I had written articles almost monthly. I had stood for Beverley and had made many speeches. I had also written 5 novels, and had hunted 3 times a week during each of the winters. And how happy I was with it all! I had suffered at Beverley, but I had suffered as a part of the work which I was desirous of doing, and I had gained my experience. I had suffered at Washington with that wretched American postmaster, and with the mosquitoes, not having been able to escape from that capital till July, but all that had added to the activity of my life. I had often groaned over those manuscripts, but I had read them, considering it, perhaps foolishly, to be a part of my duty as editor. And though in the quick production of my novels I had always ringing in my ears that terrible condemnation and scorn produced by the great man in Paternoster Row, I was nevertheless proud of having done so much. I always had a pen in my hand. Whether crossing the seas, or fighting with American officials, or tramping about the streets of Beverley, I could do a little, and generally more than a little.
I had long since convinced myself that in such work as mine the great secret consisted in acknowledging myself to be bound to rules of labour similar to those which an artisan or a mechanic is forced to obey. A shoemaker, when he has finished one pair of shoes, does not sit down and contemplate his work in idle satisfaction. "There is my pair of shoes, finished at last! What a pair of shoes it is!" The shoemaker who so indulged himself would be without wages half his time. It is the same with a professional writer of books. An author may of course want time to study a new subject. He will at any rate assure himself that there is some such good reason why he should pause. He does pause, and will be idle for a month or two while he tells himself how beautiful is that last pair of shoes which he has finished. Having thought much of all this, and having made up my mind that I could be really happy only when I was at work, I had now quite accustomed myself to begin a second pair as soon as the first was out of my hands. End of Chapter 17. Recording by Jessica Louise, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Chapter 18 of the Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. The Vicar of Bullhampton. Sir Harry Hotspur. An Editor's Tales. Caesar. In 1869 I was called on to decide, in council with my two boys and their mother, what should be their destination in life. In June of that year the elder, who was then 23, was called to the bar, and as he had gone through the regular courses of lecturing, tuition, and study, it might be supposed that his course was already decided. But just as he was called there seemed to be an opening for him in another direction, and this, joined to the terrible uncertainty of the bar, the terror of which was not in his case lessened by any peculiar forensic aptitudes, induced us to sacrifice dignity in quest of success. Mr. Frederick Chapman, who was then the sole representative of the publishing house known as Messrs. Chapman and Hall, wanted a partner, and my son Henry went into the firm. He remained there 3 years and a half, but he did not like it, nor do I think he made a very good publisher. At any rate, he left the business with perhaps more pecuniary success than might have been expected from the short period of his labours, and has since taken himself to literature as a profession. Whether he will work at it so hard as his father, and write as many books, may be doubted. My second son, Frederick, had very early in life gone to Australia, having resolved on a colonial career when he found that boys who did not grow so fast as he did got above him at school. This departure was a great pang to his mother and me, but it was permitted on the understanding that he was to come back when he was 21, and then decide whether he would remain in England or return to the colonies. In the winter of 1868 he did come to England, and had a season's hunting in the old country, but there was no doubt in his own mind as to his settling in Australia. His purpose was fixed, and in the spring of 1869 he made his second journey out. As I have since that date made 2 journeys to see him, of one of which at any rate I shall have to speak, as I wrote a long book on the Australian colonies, I will have an opportunity of saying a word or two further on of him and his doings. The Vicar of Bullhampton was written in 1868 for publication in Once a Week, a periodical then belonging to Messrs. Bradbury and Evans. It was not to come out till 1869, and I, as was my wont, had made my terms long previously to the proposed date. I had made my terms and written my story, and sent it to the publisher long before it was wanted, and so far my mind was at rest. The date fixed was the 1st of July, which date had been named in accordance with the exigencies of the editor of the periodical. An author who writes for these publications is bound to suit himself to these exigencies, and can generally do so without personal loss or inconvenience, if he will only take time by the forelock. With all the pages that I have written for magazines, I have never been a day late, nor have I ever caused inconvenience by sending less or more matter than I had stipulated to supply.
but I have sometimes found myself compelled to suffer by the irregularity of others. I have endeavoured to console myself by reflecting that such must ever be the fate of virtue. The industrious must feed the idle. The honest and simple will always be the prey of the cunning and fraudulent. The punctual, who keep none waiting for them, are doomed to wait perpetually for the unpunctual. But these earthly sufferers know that they are making their way heavenwards, and their oppressors their way elsewards. If the former reflection does not suffice for consolation, the deficiency is made up by the second. I was terribly aggrieved on the matter of the publication of my new Vicar, and had to think very much of the ultimate rewards of punctuality and its opposite. About the end of March 1869 I got a dolorous letter from the editor. All the Once a Week people were in a terrible trouble. They had bought the right of translating one of Victor Hugo's modern novels, L'Homme Curie. They had bad fixed date, relying on positive pledges from the French publishers, and now the great French author had postponed his work from week to week and from month to month, and it had so come to pass that the Frenchman's grinning hero would have to appear exactly at the same time as my clergyman. Was it not quite apparent to me, the editor asked, that Once a Week could not hold the two? Would I allow my clergyman to make his appearance in the Gentleman's Magazine instead? My disgust at this proposition was, I think, chiefly due to Victor Hugo's latter novels, which I regard as pretentious and untrue to nature. To this perhaps was added some feeling of indignation that I should be asked to give way to a Frenchman. The Frenchman had broken his engagement. He had failed to have his work finished by the stipulated time. From week to week and from month to month he had put off the fulfilment of his duty, and because of these laches on his part, on the part of this sententious French Radical, I was to be thrown over. Virtue sometimes finds it difficult to console herself even with the double comfort. I would not come out in the Gentleman's Magazine, and as the grinning man could not be got out of the way, my novel was published in separate numbers. The same thing has occurred to me more than once since. "You are no doubt regular," a publisher has said to me, "but Mr. is irregular. He has thrown me out, and I cannot be ready for you till 3 months after the time named." In these emergencies I have given perhaps half of what was wanted, and have refused to give the other half. I have endeavoured to fight my own battle fairly, and at the same time not to make myself unnecessarily obstinate. But the circumstances have impressed on my mind the great need there is that men engaged in literature should feel themselves to be bound to the industry as men know that they are bound in other callings. There does exist, I fear, a feeling that authors, because they are authors, are relieved from the necessity of paying attention to everyday rules. A writer, if he be making £800 a year, does not think himself bound to live modestly on £600, and put by the remainder for his wife and children. He does not understand that he should sit down at his desk at a certain hour. He imagines that publishers and booksellers should keep all their engagements with him to the letter, but that he, as a brain worker, and conscious of the subtle nature of the brain, should be able to exempt himself from bonds when it suits him. He has his own theory about inspiration, which will not always come, especially will not come if wine cups overnight have been too deep. All this has ever been odious to me, as being unmanly. A man may be frail in health, and therefore unable to do as he has contracted in whatever grade of life. He who has been blessed with physical strength to work day by day, year by year, as has been my case, should pardon deficiencies caused by sickness or infirmity. I may in this respect have been a little hard on others, and if so, I here record my repentance. But I think that no allowance should be given to claims for exemption from punctuality, made, if not absolutely on the score, still with the conviction of intellectual superiority. The Vicar of Bullhampton was written chiefly with the object of exciting not only pity but sympathy for fallen women, and of raising a feeling of forgiveness for such in the minds of other women. I could not venture to make this female the heroine of my story. To have made her a heroine at all would have been directly opposed to my purpose. It was necessary, therefore, that she should be a second-rate personage in the tale, but it was with reference to her life that the tale was written, and the hero and the heroine with their belongings are all subordinate. To this novel I affixed a preface, in doing which I was acting in defiance of my old established principle. I do not know that any one read it, but as I wish to have it read, I will insert it here again. I have introduced in The Vicar of Bullhampton the character of a girl whom I will call, for want of a truer word that shall not in its truth be offensive, a castaway. I have endeavoured to endow her with qualities that may create sympathy, and I have brought her back at last from degradation, at least to decency. I have not married her to a wealthy lover, and I have endeavoured to explain that though there was possible to her a way out of perdition, still things could not be with her as they would have been had she not fallen. There arises, of course, the question whether a novelist, who professes to write for the amusement of the young of both sexes, should allow himself to bring upon his stage a character such as that of Carry Brattle. It is not long since, it is well within the memory of the author, that the very existence of such a condition of life as was hers was supposed to be unknown to our sisters and daughters, and was in truth unknown to many of them. Whether that ignorance was good may be questioned, but that it exists no longer is beyond question. Then arises the further question, how far the conditions of such unfortunates should be made a matter of concern to the sweet young hearts of those whose delicacy and cleanliness of thought is a matter of pride to so many of us. Cannot women who are good pity the sufferings of the vicious, and do something perhaps to mitigate and shorten them without contamination from the vice? It will be admitted probably by most men who have thought upon the subject, that no fault among us is punished so heavily as that fault, often so light in itself, but so terrible in its consequences to the less faulty of the two offenders, by which a woman falls. All of her own sex is against her, and all those of the other sex, in whose veins runs the blood which she is thought to have contaminated, and who of nature would befriend her, were her trouble any other than it is. She is what she is, and she remains in her abject, pitiless, unutterable misery, because this sentence of the world has placed her beyond the helping hand of love and friendship. It may be said, no doubt, that the severity of this judgment acts as a protection to female virtue, deterring, as all known punishments do deter, from vice. But this punishment, which is horrible beyond the conception of those who have not regarded it closely, is not known beforehand. Instead of the punishment there is seen a false glitter of gaudy life, a glitter which is damnably false, and which, alas, has been more often portrayed in glowing colours for the injury of young girls, than have those horrors which ought to deter, with the dark shadowings which belong to them. To write in fiction of one so fallen as the noblest of her sex, as one to be rewarded because of her weakness, as one whose life is happy, bright, and glorious, is certainly to allure to vice and misery. But it may perhaps be possible that if the matter be handled with truth to life, some girl who would have been thoughtless may be made thoughtful, or some parent's heart may be softened. Those were my ideas when I conceived the story, and with that feeling I described the characters of Carry Brattle and of her family. I have not introduced her lover on the scene, nor have I presented her to the reader in the temporary enjoyment of any of those fallacious luxuries, the longing for which is sometimes more seductive to evil than love itself. She is introduced as a poor abased creature, who hardly knows how false were her dreams, with very little of the Magdalen about her, because though there may be Magdalens, they are not often found, but with an intense horror of the sufferings of her position. Such being her condition, will they who naturally are her friends protect her? The vicar who has taken her by the hand endeavours to excite them to charity, but father and brother and sister are alike hard-hearted. It had been my purpose at first that the hand of every Brattle should be against her, but my own heart was too soft to enable me to make the mother cruel, or the unmarried sister who had been the early companion of the forlorn one. As regards all the Brattles, the story is, I think, well told. The characters are true.
and the scenes at the mill are in keeping with human nature. For the rest of the book I have little to say. It is not very bad, and it certainly is not very good. As I have myself forgotten what the heroine does and says, except that she tumbles into a ditch, I cannot expect that anyone else should remember her. But I have forgotten nothing that was done or said by any of the Braddles. The question brought in argument is one of fearful importance. As to the view to be taken first, there can, I think, be no doubt. In regard to a sin common to the two sexes, almost all the punishment and all the disgrace is heaped upon the one who in 9 cases out of 10 has been the least sinful. And the punishment inflicted is of such a nature that it hardly allows room for repentance. How is the woman to return to decency to whom no decent door is opened? Then comes the answer. It is to the severity of the punishment alone that we can trust to keep women from falling. Such is the argument used in favour of the existing practice, and such the excuse given for their severity by women who will relax nothing of their harshness. But in truth the severity of the punishment is not known beforehand. It is not in the least understood by women in general, except by those who suffer it. The gaudy dirt, the squalid plenty, the contumely of familiarity, the absence of all good words and all good things, the banishment from honest labour, the being compassed round with lies, the flaunting glare of fictitious revelry, the weary pavement, the horrid slavery to some horrid tyrant, and then the quick depreciation of that one wear of beauty, the substituted paint, garments bright without but foul within like painted sepulchres, hunger, thirst, and strong drink, life without a hope, without the certainty even of a morrow's breakfast, utterly friendless, disease, starvation, and a quivering fear of that coming hell which still can hardly be worse than all that is suffered here. This is the life to which we doom our erring daughters, when because of their error we close our door upon them. But for our erring sons we find pardon easily enough. Of course there are houses of refuge, from which it has been thought expedient to banish everything pleasant, as though the only repentance to which we can afford to give a place must necessarily be one of sackcloth and ashes. It is hardly thus that we can hope to recall those to decency, who, if they are to be recalled at all, must be induced to obey the summons before they have reached the last stage of that misery which I have attempted to describe. To me, the mistake which we too often make seems to be this, that the girl who has gone astray is put out of sight, out of mind, if possible, at any rate out of speech, as though she had never existed, and that this ferocity comes not only from a hatred of the sin, but in part also from a dread of the taint which the sin brings with it. Very low as is the degradation to which a girl is brought when she falls through love or vanity, or perhaps from a longing for luxurious ease, still much lower is that to which she must descend perforce when, through the hardness of the world around her, she converts that sin into a trade. Mothers and sisters, when the misfortune comes upon them of a fallen female from among their number, should remember this, and not fear contamination so strongly as did Carry Braddle's married sister and sister-in-law. In 1870 I brought out 3 books, or rather of the latter of the 3 I must say that it was brought out by others, for I had nothing to do with it except to write it. These were Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite, an editor's tales, and a little volume on Julius Caesar. Sir Harry Hotspur was written on the same plan as Nina Balatka and Linda Tressel, and had for its object the telling of some pathetic incident in life rather than the portraiture of a number of human beings. Nina and Linda Tressel and The Golden Lion had been placed in foreign countries, and this was an English story. In other respects it is of the same nature, and was not, I think, by any means a failure. There is much of pathos in the love of the girl, and of paternal dignity and affection in the father.
It was published first in Macmillan's Magazine, by the intelligent proprietor of which I have since been told that it did not make either his fortune or that of his magazine. I am sorry that it should not have been so, but I fear that the same thing may be said of a good many of my novels. When it had passed through the magazine, the subsequent use of it was sold to other publishers by Mr. Macmillan, and then I learned that it was to be brought out by them as a novel in 2 volumes. Now it had been sold by me as a novel in 1 volume, and hence there arose a correspondence. I found it very hard to make the purchasers understand that I had reasonable ground for objection to the process. What was it to me? How could it injure me if they stretched my pages by means of lead and margin into double the number I had intended? I have heard the same argument on other occasions. When I have pointed out that in this way the public would have to suffer, seeing that they would have to pay Mudie for the use of 2 volumes in reading that which ought to have been given to them in 1, I have been assured that the public are pleased with literary short measure, that it is the object of novel readers to get through novels as fast as they can, and that the shorter each volume is the better. Even this, however, did not overcome me, and I stood to my guns. Sir Harry was published in 1 volume, containing something over the normal 300 pages, with an average of 220 words to a page, which I had settled with my conscience to be the proper length of novel volume. I may here mention that on one occasion, and one occasion only, a publisher got the better of me in matter of volumes. He had a 2-volume novel of mine running through a certain magazine, and had it printed complete in 3 volumes before I knew where I was, before I had seen a sheet of the letterpress. I stormed for a while, but I had not the heart to make him break up the type. The Editor's Tales was a volume republished from the St. Paul's Magazine, and professed to give an editor's experience of his dealings with contributors. I do not think that there is a single incident in the book which could bring back to any one concerned the memory of a past event. And yet there is not an incident in it the outline of which was not presented to my mind by the remembrance of some fact. How an ingenious gentleman got into conversation with me, I not knowing that he knew me to be an editor, and pressed his little article on my notice. How I was addressed by a lady with a becoming pseudonym, and with much equally becoming audacity. How I was appealed to by the dearest of little women, whom here I have called Mary Gresley. How in my own early days there was a struggle over an abortive periodical which was intended to be the best thing ever done. How terrible was the tragedy of a poor drunkard, who with infinite learning at his command made one sad final effort to reclaim himself, and perished while he was making it. And lastly, how a poor weak editor was driven nearly to madness by threatened litigation from a rejected contributor. Of these stories, The Spotted Dog, with the struggles of the drunkard scholar, is the best. I know now, however, that when the things are good they came out too quick one upon another to gain much attention, and so also luckily when they were bad. The Caesar was a thing of itself. My friend John Blackwood had set on foot a series of small volumes called Ancient Classics for English Readers, and had placed the editing of them, and the compiling of many of them, in the hands of William Lucas Collins, a clergyman who from my connection with the series became a most intimate friend. The Iliad and the Odyssey had already come out when I was at Edinburgh with John Blackwood, and on my expressing my very strong admiration for those 2 little volumes, which I here recommend to all young ladies as the most charming tales they can read, he asked me whether I would not undertake one myself. Herodotus was in the press, but if I could get it ready mine should be next. Whereupon I offered to say what might be said to the readers of English on the Commentaries of Julius Caesar. I at once went to work, and in 3 months from that day the little book had been written. I began by reading through the Commentaries twice, which I did without any assistance either by translation or English notes. Latin was not so familiar to me then as it has become since, for from that date I have almost daily spent an hour with some Latin author, and on many days many hours. After reading what my author had left behind him, I fell into the reading of what others had written about him, in Latin, in English, and even in French, for I went through much of that most futile book by the late Emperor of the French.
I do not know that for a short period I ever worked harder. The amount I had to write was nothing. 3 weeks would have done it easily. But I was most anxious, in this soaring out of my own peculiar line, not to disgrace myself. I do not think that I did disgrace myself. Perhaps I was anxious for something more. If so, I was disappointed. The book I think to be a good little book. It is readable by all, young and old, and it gives, I believe accurately, both an account of Caesar's Commentaries, which of course was the primary intention, and the chief circumstances of the great Roman's life. A well-educated girl who had read it and remembered it would perhaps know as much about Caesar and his writings as she need know. Beyond the consolation of thinking as I do about it, I got very little gratification from the work. Nobody praised it. One very old and very learned friend to whom I sent it thanked me for my comic Caesar, but said no more. I do not suppose that he intended to run a dagger into me. Of any suffering from such wounds, I think, while living I never showed a sign, but still I have suffered occasionally. There was, however, probably present to my friend's mind, and to that of others, a feeling that a man who has spent his life in writing English novels would not be fit to write about Caesar. It was as when an amateur gets a picture hung on the walls of the Academy. What business had I there? Ne sutor ultra crepidam. In the press it was most faintly damned by most faint praise. Nevertheless, having read the book again within the last month or two, I make bold to say that it is a good book. The series, I believe, has done very well. I am sure that it ought to do well in years to come, for, putting aside Caesar, the work has been done with infinite scholarship, and very generally with a light hand. With the leave of my sententious and sonorous friend, who had not endured that subjects which had been grave to him should be treated irreverently, I will say that such a work, unless it be light, cannot answer the purpose for which it is intended. It was not exactly a school book that was wanted, but something that would carry the purposes of the schoolroom even into the leisure hours of adult pupils. Nothing was ever better suited for such a purpose than the Iliad and the Odyssey as done by Mr. Collins. The Virgil, also done by him, is very good, and so is the Aristophanes by the same hand. End of Chapter 18. Recording by Jessica Louise, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Chapter 19 of the Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. Ralph the Heir. The Eustace Diamonds. Lady Anna. Australia. In the spring of 1871, I and my wife, had decided that we would go to Australia to visit our shepherd son. Of course, before doing so, I made a contract with a publisher for a book about the colonies. For such a work as this I had always been aware that I could not fairly demand more than half the price that would be given for the same amount of fiction, and as such books have an indomitable tendency to stretch themselves, so that more is given than what is sold, and as the cost of travelling is heavy, the writing of them is not remunerative. This tendency to stretch comes not, I think, generally from the ambition of the writer, but from his inability to comprise the different parts in their allotted spaces. If you have to deal with a country, a colony, a city, a trade, or a political opinion, it is so much easier to deal with it in 20 than in 12 pages. I also made an engagement with the editor of a London daily paper to supply him with a series of articles, which were duly written, duly published, and duly paid for. But with all this, travelling with the object of writing is not a good trade. If the travelling author can pay his bills, he must be a good manager on the road. Before starting there came upon us the terrible necessity of coming to some resolution about our house at Waltham. It had been first hired and then bought, primarily because it suited my post office avocations. To this reason had been added other attractions, in the shape of hunting, gardening, and suburban hospitalities. Altogether the house had been a success, and the scene of much happiness. But there arose questions as to expense. Would not a house in London be cheaper? There could be no doubt that my income would decrease, and was decreasing. I had thrown the post office, as it were, away, and the writing of novels could not go on for ever. Some of my friends told me already that at 55 I ought to give up the fabrication of love stories. The hunting, I thought, must go soon, and I would not therefore allow that to keep me in the country. And then, why should I live at Waltham Cross now, seeing that I had fixed on that place in reference to the post office? It was therefore determined that we would flit, and as we were to be away for 18 months, we determined also to sell our furniture. So there was a packing up with many tears, and consultations as to what should be saved out of the things we loved. As must take place on such an occasion, there was some heartfelt grief. But the thing was done, and orders were given for the letting or sale of the house. I may as well say here that it never was let, and that it remained unoccupied for 2 years before it was sold. I lost by the transaction about £800. As I continually hear that other men make money by buying and selling houses, I presume I am not well adapted for transactions of that sort. I have never made money by selling anything except a manuscript. In matters of horseflesh I am so inefficient that I have generally given away horses that I have not wanted. When we started from Liverpool in May 1871, Ralph the Heir was running through the St. Paul's. This was the novel of which Charles Reade afterwards took the plot and made on it a play. I have always thought it to be one of the worst novels I have written, and almost to have justified that dictum that a novelist after 50 should not write love stories. It was in part a political novel, and that part which appertains to politics, and which recounts the electioneering expenses of the candidates at Percy Cross, is well enough. Percy Cross and Beverley were of course one and the same place. Neefit, the breeches maker, and his daughter are also good in their way, and Moggs, the daughter's lover, who was not only lover but also one of the candidates at Percy Cross as well. But the main thread of the story, that which tells of the doings of the young gentlemen and young ladies, the heroes and the heroines, is not good. Ralph the Heir has not much life about him, while Ralph who is not the heir, but is intended to be the real hero, has none. The same may be said of the young ladies, of whom one, she who was meant to be the chief, has passed utterly out of my mind without leaving a trace of remembrance behind. I also left in the hands of the editor of the Fortnightly, ready for production on the 1st of July following, a story called The Eustace Diamonds. In that I think that my friend's dictum was disproved. There is not much love in it, but what there is good. The character of Lucy Morris is pretty, and her love is as genuine and as well told as that of Lucy Robarts or Lily Dale. But The Eustace Diamonds achieved the success which it certainly did attain, not as a love story, but as a record of a cunning little woman of pseudo fashion, to whom in her cunning there came a series of adventures, unpleasant enough in themselves, but pleasant to the reader. As I wrote the book, the idea constantly presented itself to me that Lizzie Eustace was but a second Becky Sharp, but in planning the character I had not thought of this, and I believe that Lizzie would have been just as she is, though Becky Sharp had never been described. The plot of the diamond necklace is, I think, well arranged, though it produced itself without any forethought. I had no idea of setting thieves after the bauble till I had got my heroine to bed in the inn at Carlisle, nor of the disappointment of the thieves till Lizzie had been wakened in the morning with the news that her door had been broken open. All these things, and many more, Wilkie Collins would have arranged before with infinite labour, preparing things present so that they should fit in with things to come. I have gone on the very much easier plan of making everything as it comes fit in with what has gone before. At any rate, the book was a success, and did much to repair the injury which I felt had come to my reputation in the novel market by the works of the last few years. I doubt whether I had written anything so successful as The Eustace Diamonds since The Small House at Allington. I had written what was much better, as for instance Phineas Finn and Nina Balatka, but that is by no means the same thing. I also left behind, in a strong box, the manuscript of Phineas Redux, a novel of which I have already spoken, and which I subsequently sold to the proprietors of the graphic newspaper. The editor of that paper greatly disliked the title, assuring me that the public would take Redux for the gentleman's surname, and was dissatisfied with me when I replied that I had no objection to them doing so. The introduction of a Latin word, or of a word from any other language, into the title of an English novel is undoubtedly in bad taste.
but after turning the matter much over in my own mind, I could find no other suitable name. I also left behind me, in the same strong box, another novel called An Eye for an Eye, which then had been some time written, and of which, as it has not even yet been published, I will not further speak. It will probably be published some day, though, looking forward, I can see no room for it at any rate for the next 2 years. If therefore the Great Britain in which we sailed for Melbourne had gone to the bottom, I had so provided that there would be new novels ready to come out under my name for some years to come. This consideration, however, did not keep me idle while I was at sea. When making long journeys I have always succeeded in getting a desk put up in my cabin, and this was done ready for me in the Great Britain, so that I could go to work the day after we left Liverpool. This I did, and before I reached Melbourne I had finished a story called Lady Anna. Every word of this was written at sea during the 2 months required for our voyage, and was done day by day, with the intermission of 1 day's illness, for 8 weeks, at the rate of 66 pages of manuscript in each week, each page of manuscript containing 250 words. Every word was counted. I have seen work come back to an author from the press with terrible deficiencies as to the amount supplied. 32 pages have perhaps been wanted for a number, and the printers with all their art could not stretch the matter to more than 28 or 9. The work of filling up must be very dreadful. I have sometimes been ridiculed for the methodical details of my business. But by these contrivances I have been preserved from many troubles, and I have saved others with whom I have worked, editors, publishers, and printers, from much trouble also. A month or 2 after my return home, Lady Anna appeared in the Fortnightly, following the Eustace Diamonds. In it a young girl, who is really a lady of high rank and great wealth, though in her youth she enjoyed none of the privileges of wealth or rank, marries a tailor who had been good to her, and whom she had loved when she was poor and neglected. A fine young noble lover is provided for her, and all the charms of sweet living with nice people are thrown in her way, in order that she may be made to give up the tailor. And the charms are very powerful with her; but the feeling that she is bound by her troth to the man who had always been true to her overcomes everything, and she marries the tailor. It was my wish, of course, to justify her in doing so, and to carry my readers along with me in my sympathy with her. But everybody found fault with me for marrying her to the tailor. What would they have said if I had allowed her to jilt the tailor and marry the good-looking young lord? How much louder then would have been the censure! The book was read, and I was satisfied. If I had not told my story well, there would have been no feeling in favour of the young lord. The horror which was expressed to me at the evil thing I had done, in giving the girl to the tailor, was the strongest testimony I could receive of the merits of the story. I went to Australia chiefly in order that I might see my son among his sheep. I did see him among his sheep, and remained with him for 4 or 5 very happy weeks. He was not making money, nor has he made money since. I grieve to say that several thousands of pounds which I had squeezed out of the pockets of perhaps too liberal publishers have been lost on the venture. But I rejoice to say that this has been in no way due to any fault of his. I never knew a man work with more persistent honesty at his trade than he has done. I had, however, the further intentions of writing a book about the entire group of Australasian colonies, and in order that I might be enabled to do that with sufficient information, I visited them all. Making my headquarters at Melbourne, I went to Queensland, New South Wales, Tasmania, and then to the very little known territory of Western Australia, and then, last of all, to New Zealand. I was absent in all 18 months, and think that I did succeed in learning much of the political, social, and material condition of these countries. I wrote my book as I was travelling, and brought it back with me to England all but completed in December 1872. It was a better book than that which I had written 11 years before on the American States, but not so good as that on the West Indies in 1859. As regards the information given, there was much more to be said about Australia than the West Indies. Very much more is said, and very much more may be learned from the latter than from the former book. I am sure that any one who will take the trouble to read the book on Australia will learn much from it, but the West Indian volume was readable. I'm not sure that either of the other works are, in the proper sense of that word. When I go back to them I find that the pages drag with me, and if so with me, how must it be with others who have none of that love which a father feels even for his ill-favoured offspring? Of all the needs a book has, the chief need is that it be readable. Feeling that these volumes on Australia were dull and long, I was surprised to find that they had an extensive sale. There were, I think, 2000 copies circulated of the first expensive edition, and then the book was divided into 4 little volumes, which were published separately, and which again had a considerable circulation. That some facts were stated inaccurately I do not doubt. That many opinions were crude I am quite sure. That I had failed to understand much which I attempted to explain is possible. But with all these faults the book was a thoroughly honest book, and was the result of unflagging labour for a period of 15 months. I spared myself no trouble in inquiry, no trouble in seeing, and no trouble in listening. I thoroughly imbued my mind with the subject, and wrote with the simple intention of giving trustworthy information on the state of the colonies. Though there be inaccuracies, those inaccuracies to which work quickly done must always be subject, I think I did give much valuable information. I came home across America from San Francisco to New York, visiting Utah and Brigham Young on the way. I did not achieve great intimacy with the great polygamist of the Salt Lake City. I called upon him, sending to him my card, apologizing for doing so without an introduction, and excusing myself by saying that I did not like to pass through the territory without seeing a man of whom I had heard so much. He received me in his doorway, not asking me to enter, and inquired whether I were not a miner. When I told him that I was not a miner, he asked me whether I earned my bread. I told him I did. "I guess you're a miner," said he. I again assured him that I was not. "Then how do you earn your bread?" I told him I did so by writing books. "I'm sure you're a miner," said he. Then he turned upon his heel, went back into the house, and closed the door. I was properly punished, as I was vain enough to conceive that he would have heard my name. I got home in December 1872, and in spite of any resolution made to the contrary, my mind was full of hunting as I came back. No real resolutions had in truth been made, for out of a stud of 4 horses I kept 3, 2 of which were absolutely idle through the 2 summers and winter of my absence. Immediately on my arrival I bought another, and settled myself down to hunting from London 3 days a week. At first I went back to Essex, my old country; but finding that to be inconvenient, I took my horses to Leighton Buzzard, and became one of that numerous herd of sportsmen who rode with the Baron and Mr. Selby Lowndes. In those days Baron Meyer was alive, and the riding with his hounds was very good. I did not care so much for Mr. Lowndes. During the winters of 1873, 1874, and 1875, I had my horses back in Essex, and went on with my hunting, always trying to resolve that I would give it up. But still I bought fresh horses, and as I did not give it up, I hunted more than ever. 3 times a week the cab has been at my door in London very punctually, and not unfrequently before 7 in the morning. In order to secure this attendance, the man has always been invited to have his breakfast in the hall. I have gone to the Great Eastern Railway, so often, with the fear that frost would make all my exertions useless, and so often too with that result; and then from one station or another station have travelled on wheels at least a dozen miles. After the day's sport, the same toil has been necessary to bring me home to dinner at 8. This has been work for a young man and a rich man, but I have done it as an old man and a comparatively poor man. Now, at last, in April 1876, I do think that my resolution has been taken. I am giving away my old horses, and anybody is welcome to my saddles and horse furniture. Singula de nobis anni praedantur entes, eripure jocos venerum conviva ladum, tendunt extorquere poemita. Our years keep taking toll as they move on. My feasts, my frolics are already gone, and now it seems my verses must go too. This is Conington's translation, but it seems to me to be a little flat. Years as they roll cut all our pleasures short, our pleasant mirth, our loves, our wine, our sport. And then they stretch their power, and crush at last even the power of singing the past. I think that I may say with truth that I rode hard to my end. Vixi puellis nuper idoneos, et militavi non sine gloria, nunc arma defuncta munque bello, barbiton hic paries habebit. I've lived about the covert side, I've ridden straight and ridden fast. Now breeches, boots, and scarlet pride are but mementos of the past. End of chapter 19. Recording by Jessica Louise, St. Paul, Minnesota. Chapter 20 of the Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Autobiography of Anthony Trollope. The Way We Live Now, and The Prime Minister. Conclusion. In what I have said at the end of the last chapter about my hunting, I have been carried a little in advance of the date at which I had arrived. We returned from Australia in the winter of 1872, and early in 1873 I took a house in Montague Square, in which I hope to live and hope to die. Our first work in settling there was to place upon new shelves the books which I had collected round myself at Waltham. And this work, which was in itself great, entailed also the labour of a new catalogue. As all who use libraries know, a catalogue is nothing unless it show the spot on which every book is to be found, information which every volume also ought to give as to itself. Only those who have done it know how great is the labour of moving and arranging a few thousand volumes. At the present moment I own about 5,000 volumes, and they are dearer to me even than the horses which are going, or than the wine in the cellar which is very apt to go, and upon which I also pride myself. When this was done, and the new furniture had got into its place, and my little book room was settled sufficiently for work, I began a novel, to the writing of which I was instigated by what I conceived to be the commercial profligacy of the age. Whether the world does or does not become more wicked as years go on is a question which probably has disturbed the minds of thinkers since the world began to think. That men have become less cruel, less violent, less selfish, less brutal, there can be no doubt. But have they become less honest? If so, can a world, retrograding from day to day in honesty, be considered to be in a state of progress? We know the opinion on this subject of our philosopher Mr. Carlyle. If he be right, we are all going straight away to darkness and the dogs. But then we do not put very much faith in Mr. Carlyle, nor in Mr. Ruskin and his other followers. The loudness and extravagance of their lamentations, the wailing and gnashing of teeth which comes from them over a world which is supposed to have gone altogether shoddywards, are so contrary to the convictions of men who cannot but see how comfort has been increased, how health has been improved, and education extended, that the general effect of their teaching is the opposite of what they had intended. It is regarded simply as Carlylism to say that the English-speaking world is growing worse from day to day. And it is Carlylism to opine that the general grand result of increased intelligence is a tendency to deterioration. Nevertheless, a certain class of dishonesty, dishonesty magnificent in its proportions and climbing into high places, has become at the same time so rampant and so splendid that there seems to be reason for fearing that men and women will be taught to feel that dishonesty, if it can become splendid, will cease to be abominable. If dishonesty can live in a gorgeous palace with pictures on all its walls, and gems in all its cupboards, with marble and ivory in all its corners, and can give Apician dinners, and get into Parliament, and deal in millions, then dishonesty is not disgraceful, and the man dishonest after such a fashion is not a low scoundrel. Instigated, I say, by some such reflections as these, I sat down in my new house to write The Way We Live Now.
and as I had ventured to take the whip of the satirist into my hand, I went beyond the iniquities of the great speculator who robs everybody, and made an onslaught also on other vices, on the intrigues of girls who want to get married, on the luxury of young men who prefer to remain single, and on the puffing propensities of authors who desire to cheat the public into buying their volumes. The book has the fault which is to be attributed to almost all satires, whether in prose or verse. The accusations are exaggerated. The vices are coloured so as to make effect rather than to represent truth. Who, when the lash of objurgation is in his hands, can so moderate his arm as never to strike harder than justice would require? The spirit which produces the satire is honest enough, but the very desire which moves the satirist to do his work energetically makes him dishonest. In other respects The Way We Live Now was, as a satire, powerful and good. The character of Melmotte is well maintained. The Bear Garden is amusing, and not untrue. The Longstaff girls and their friend Lady Monogram are amusing, but exaggerated. Dolly Longstaff is, I think, very good. And Lady Carbury's literary efforts are, I am sorry to say, such as are too frequently made. But here again the young lady with her two lovers is weak and vapid. I almost doubt whether it be not impossible to have two absolutely distinct parts in a novel, and to imbue them both with interest. If they be distinct, the one will seem to be no more than padding to the other. And so it was in The Way We Live Now. The interest of the story lies among the wicked and foolish people, with Melmotte and his daughter, with Dolly and his family, with the American woman, Mrs. Hurtle, and with John Crumb and the girl of his heart. But Roger Carbury, Paul Montague, and Henrietta Carbury are uninteresting. Upon the whole, I by no means look upon the book as one of my failures, nor was it taken as a failure by the public or the press. While I was writing The Way We Live Now, I was called upon by the proprietors of the Graphic for a Christmas story. I feel with regard to literature somewhat as I suppose an upholsterer and undertaker feels when he is called upon to supply a funeral. He has to supply it, however distasteful it may be. It is his business, and he will starve if he neglects it. So have I felt that, when anything in the shape of a novel was required, I was bound to produce it. Nothing can be more distasteful to me than to have to give a relish of Christmas to what I write. I feel the humbug implied by the nature of the order. A Christmas story, in the proper sense, should be the ebullition of some mind anxious to instil others with a desire for Christmas religious thought, or Christmas festivities, or, better still, with Christmas charity. Such was the case with Dickens when he wrote his two first Christmas stories. But since that, the things written annually, all of which have been fixed to Christmas like children's toys to a Christmas tree, have had no real savour of Christmas about them. I had done 2 or 3 before. Alas, at this very moment I have one to write, which I have promised to supply within 3 weeks of this time. The picture makers always require a long interval, as to which I have in vain been cudgelling my brain for the last month. I can't send away the order to another shop, but I do not know how I shall ever get the coffin made. For the Graphic in 1873 I wrote a little story about Australia. Christmas at the Antipodes is of course midsummer, and I was not loath to describe the troubles to which my own son had been subjected, by the mingled accidents of heat and bad neighbours, on his station in the bush. So I wrote Harry Heathcote of Gangoil, and was well through my labour on that occasion. I only wish I may have no worse success in that which now hangs over my head. When Harry Heathcote was over, I returned with a full heart to Lady Glencora and her husband. I had never yet drawn the completed picture of such a statesman as my imagination had conceived. The personages with whose names my pages had been familiar, and perhaps even the minds of some of my readers, the Brocks, De Terriers, Monks, Greshams, and Daubeneys, had been more or less portraits, not of living men, but of living political characters. The strong-minded, thick-skinned, useful, ordinary member,
either of the Government or of the Opposition, had been very easy to describe, and had required no imagination to conceive. The character reproduces itself from generation to generation, and as it does so becomes shorn in a wonderful way of those little touches of humanity which would be destructive of its purposes. Now and again there comes a burst of human nature, as in the quarrel between Burke and Fox; but as a rule the men submit themselves to be shaped and fashioned, and to be formed into tools which are used either for building up or pulling down, and can generally bear to be changed from this box into the other, without at any rate the appearance of much personal suffering. 24 gentlemen will amalgamate themselves into one whole, and work for one purpose, having each of them to set aside his own idiosyncrasy, and to endure the close personal contact of men who must often be personally disagreeable, having been thoroughly taught that in no other way can they serve either their country or their own ambition. These are the men who are publicly useful, and whom the necessities of the age supply, as to whom I have never ceased to wonder that stones of such strong calibre should be so quickly worn down to the shape and smoothness of rounded pebbles. Such have been to me the Brocks and the Mildmays, about whom I have written with great pleasure, having had my mind much exercised in watching them. But had I also conceived the character of a statesman of a different nature, of a man who should be in something perhaps superior, but in very much inferior, to these men, of one who could not become a pebble, having too strong an identity of his own, to rid oneself of fine scruples, to fall into the traditions of a party, to feel the need of subservience, not only in acting but also even in thinking, to be able to be a bit, and at first only a very little bit, these are the necessities of the growing statesman. The time may come, the glorious time, when some great self-action shall be possible, and shall be even demanded, as when Peel gave up the Corn Laws; but the rising man, as he puts on his harness, should not allow himself to dream of this. To become a good, round, smooth, hard, useful pebble is his duty, and to achieve this he must harden his skin and swallow his scruples. But every now and again we see the attempt, made by men who cannot get their skins to be hard, who after a little while generally fall out of the ranks. The statesman of whom I was thinking, of whom I had long thought, was one who did not fall out of the ranks, even though his skin would not become hard. He should have rank and intellect and parliamentary habits, by which to bind him to the service of his country, and he should also have unblemished, unextinguishable, inexhaustible love of country. That virtue I attribute to our statesmen generally. They who are without it are, I think, mean indeed. This man should have it as the ruling principle of his life, and it should so rule him that all other things should be made to give way to it. But he should be scrupulous, and being scrupulous, weak. When called to the highest place in the council of his sovereign, he should feel with true modesty his own insufficiency, but not the less should the greed of power grow upon him when he had once allowed himself to taste and enjoy it. Such was the character I endeavoured to depict in describing the triumph, the troubles, and the failure of my Prime Minister. And I think that I have succeeded. What the public may think, or what the press may say, I do not yet know, the work having as yet run but half its course. [Footnote: Writing this note in 1878, after a lapse of nearly 3 years, I am obliged to say that as regards the public, the Prime Minister was a failure. It was worse spoken of by the press than any novel I had written. It was specially hurt by a criticism on it in the Spectator. The critic who wrote the article I know to be a good critic, inclined to be more than fair to me, but in this case I could not agree with him, so much do I love the man whose character I had endeavoured to portray. That the man's character should be understood as I understand it, or that of his wife's, the delineation of which has also been a matter of much happy care to me, I have no right to expect, seeing that the operation of describing has not been confined to one novel, which might perhaps be read through by the majority of those who commenced it. It has been carried on through 3 or 4, each of which will be forgotten even by the most zealous reader almost as soon as read. In The Prime Minister, my Prime Minister will not allow his wife to take office among, or even over, those ladies who are attached by office to the Queen's Court. "I should not choose," he says to her, "that my wife should have any duties unconnected with our joint family and home." Who will remember, in reading those words, that in a former story, published some years before, he tells his wife, when she has twitted him with his willingness to clean the Premier's shoes, that he would even allow her to clean them if it were for the good of the country? And yet it is by such details as these that I have, for many years past, been manufacturing within my own mind the characters of the man and his wife. I think that Plantagenet Palliser, Duke of Omnium, is a perfect gentleman. If he be not, then am I unable to describe a gentleman. She is by no means a perfect lady, but if she be not all over a woman, then I am not able to describe a woman. I do not think it probable that my name will remain among those who in the next century will be known as the writers of English prose fiction; but if it does, that permanence of success will probably rest on the character of Plantagenet Palliser, Lady Glencora, and the Reverend Mr. Crawley. I have now come to the end of that long series of books written by myself, with which the public is already acquainted. Of those which I may hereafter be able to add to them I cannot speak, though I have an idea that I shall even yet once more have recourse to my political hero as the mainstay of another story. When The Prime Minister was finished, I at once began another novel, which is now completed in 3 volumes, and which is called Is He Popenjoy? There are 2 Popenjoys in the book, one succeeding to the title held by the other, but as they are both babies, and do not in the course of the story progress beyond babyhood, the future readers, should the tale ever be published, will not be much interested in them. Nevertheless, the story, as a story, is not, I think, amiss. Since that, I have written still another 3-volume novel, to which, very much in opposition to my publisher, I have given the name The American Senator. The American Senator and Popenjoy have appeared, each with fair success. Neither of them has encountered that reproach which, in regard to the Prime Minister, seemed to tell me that my work as a novelist should be brought to a close. And yet I feel assured that they are very inferior to the Prime Minister. It is to appear in Temple Bar, and is to commence its appearance on the 1st of the next month. Such being its circumstances, I do not know that I can say anything else about it here. And so I end the record of my literary performances, which I think are more in amount than the works of any other living English author. If any English authors not living have written more, as may probably have been the case, I do not know who they are. I find that, taking the books which have appeared under our names, I have published much more than twice as much as Carlyle. I have also published considerably more than Voltaire, even including his letters. We are told that Varro, at the age of 80, had written 480 volumes, and that he went on writing for 8 years longer. I wish I knew what was the length of Varro's volumes. I comfort myself by reflecting that the amount of manuscript described as a book in Varro's time was not much. Varro too is dead, and Voltaire, whereas I am still living, and may add to the pile. The following is a list of the books I have written, with the dates of publication and the sums I have received for them. The dates given are the years in which the works were published as a whole, most of them having appeared before in some serial form. Names of works, date of publication, total sum received. The Macdermots of Ballycloran, 1847, 4869. The Kellys and the O'Kellys, 1848, 123, 19, 5. La Vendée, 1850, 20, 0, 0. The Warden, 1855, 727, 11, 3. Barchester Towers, 1857. The Three Clerks, 1858, 250, 0, 0. Dr. Thorne, 1858, 400, 0, 0. The West Indies and the Spanish Main, 1859, 250, 00. The Bertrams, 1859, 400, 00. Carried forward, 2219, 1617. Names of works, date of publication, total sums received. Brought forward, 2219, 1617. Castle Richmond, 1860, 600, 00. Framley Parsonage, 1861, 1000, 00. Tales of All Countries, first series, 1861. Second series, 1863, more than 1830, 00. Third edition, 1870. Orley Farm, 1862, 3135, 00. North America, 1862, 1250, 00. Rachel Ray, 1863, 1645, 00. The Small House at Allington, 1864, 3000, 00. Can You Forgive Her, 1864, 3525, 00. Miss Mackenzie, 1865, 1300, 00. The Belton Estate, 1866, 1757, 00. The Claverings, 1867, 2800, 00. The Last Chronicle of Barset, 1867, 3000, 00. Nina Balatka, 1867, 450, 00. Linda Tressel, 1868, 450, 00. Phineas Finn, 1869, 3200, 00. He Knew He Was Right, 1869, 3200, 00. Brown, Jones, and Robinson, 1870, 600, 00. The Vicar of Bullhampton, 1870, 2500, 00. An Editor's Tales, 1870, 378, 00. Caesar, Ancient Classics, 1870, 000. Footnote: This was given by me as a present to my friend John Blackwood. Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite, 1871, 750, 00. Ralph the Heir, 1871, 2500, 00. The Golden Lion of Granpere, 1872, 550, 00. The Eustace Diamonds, 1873, 2500, 00. Australia and New Zealand, 1873, 1300, 00. Phineas Redux, 1874, 2500, 00. Harry Heathcote of Gangoil, 1874, 450, 00. Carry forward, 48,389, 17/5. Names of works, date of publication, total sum received. Brought forward, 48,389, 17/5. Lady Anna, 1874, 1200, 00. The Way We Live Now, 1875, 3000, 00. The Prime Minister, 1876, 2500, 00. The American Senator, 1877, 1800, 00. Is He Popenjoy, 1878, 1600, 00. South Africa, 1878, 850, 00. John Caldegate, 1879, 1800, 00. Sundries, 7800, 00. 68,939, 17/5. It will not, I am sure, be thought that in making my boast as to the quantity I have endeavoured to lay claim to any literary excellence. That in the writing of books quantity without quality is a vice and a misfortune has been too manifestly settled to leave a doubt on such a matter. But I do lay claim to whatever merit should be accorded to me for persevering diligence in my profession. And I make the claim, not with a view to my own glory, but for the benefit of those who may read these pages, and when young may intend to follow the same career. Nulla dies sine linea, let that be their motto. And let their work be to them as is his common work to the common labourer. No gigantic efforts will then be necessary. He need tie no wet towels round his brow, nor sit for 30 hours at his desk without moving, as men have sat or said that they have sat. More than 9/10 of my literary work has been done in the last 20 years, and during 12 of those years I followed another profession. I have never been a slave to this work, giving due time, if not more than due time, to the amusements I have loved. But I have been constant, and constancy in labour will conquer all difficulties. Gutta cavat lapidem non vi, sed saepe cadendo. It may interest some if I state that during the last 20 years I have made by literature something near 70,000. As I have said before in these pages, I look upon the result as comfortable, but not splendid. It will not, I trust, be supposed by any reader that I have intended in this so-called autobiography to give a record of my inner life. No man ever did so truly, and no man ever will. Rousseau probably attempted it, but who doubts but that Rousseau has confessed in much the thoughts and convictions rather than the facts of his life? If the rustle of a woman's petticoat has ever stirred my blood, if a cup of wine has been a joy to me, if I have thought tobacco at midnight in pleasant company to be one of the elements of an earthly paradise, if now and again I have somewhat recklessly fluttered a 5-note over a card table, of what matter is that to any reader? I have betrayed no woman. Wine has brought me to no sorrow. It has been the companionship of smoking that I have loved rather than the habit. I have never desired to win money, and I have lost none. To enjoy the excitement of pleasure, but to be free from its vices and ill effects, to have the sweet and leave the bitter untasted, that has been my study. The preachers tell us that this is impossible. It seems to me that hitherto I have succeeded fairly well. I will not say that I have never scorched a finger, but I carry no ugly wounds. For what remains to me of life, I trust for my happiness still chiefly to my work, hoping that when the power of work be over with me, God may be pleased to take me from a world in which, according to my view, there can be no joy. Secondly, to the love of those who love me, and then to my books. That I can read and be happy while I am reading is a great blessing. Could I remember, as some men do, what I read, I should have been able to call myself an educated man, but that power I have never possessed. Something is always left, something dim and inaccurate, but still something sufficient to preserve the taste for more. I am inclined to think that it is so with most readers. Of late years, putting aside the Latin classics, I found my greatest pleasure in our old English dramatists, not from any excessive love of their work, which often irritates me by its want of truth to nature, even while it shames me by its language, but from curiosity in searching their plots and examining their character. If I live a few years longer, I shall, I think, leave in my copies of these dramatists, down to the close of James I., written criticisms on every play. No one who has not looked closely into it knows how many there are. Now I stretch out my hand, and from the further shore I bid adieu to all who have cared to read any among the many words that I have written. End of Chapter 20. Recording by Jessica Louise, Minneapolis, Minnesota. End of the Autobiography of Anthony Trollope.